Free will. Do you have it? Let's find out today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Greetings, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. We here at the Nathan Jacobs Podcast took our first ever pause for a week for the Thanksgiving festivities. But now we are back, and we have a lot of exciting things on the horizon for you. In anticipation of Christmas, we have a couple of Christmas episodes coming up. We've got some interviews scheduled that I'm particularly excited about, as well as the much anticipated series on the problem of evil. So that is something that a lot of folks have asked about. It's come up from time to time. And I just finished my book on Leibniz and the problem of evil. So perfect timing, fresh on my mind. Looking forward to doing that. As far as today is concerned, we have the other much anticipated episode on free will. So we sort of teased this a couple of weeks ago when we dropped the audio letter that I had done on free will. But now is time for the full-blown episode. So this is something that has been requested a number of times in the comments. So be encouraged. We actually do pay attention to what you have to say. And so if there are topics that you are just dying to hear me weigh in on, feel free to throw those in the comments. We do actually look at those and try to make sure that we are addressing the sorts of things that are of maximal interest to you, our audience, our beloved dear listeners. So anyway, one of those is the topic of free will, obviously a topic that has come up time and again in a variety of contexts here. And so a number of folks have asked me to weigh in on matters of free will and determinism and things like that. So that's what's on the docket here today. So this topic is actually a finely nuanced one. There's a very long history to the discussion about free will, and specifically free will, determinism, all these sorts of things. And we're going to begin by talking about those terms. But suffice it to say that I had mentioned I just finished up a book on Leibniz, and this is all intimately related. This topic is intimately related to the work that I did there on Leibniz, because much of the research and the writing and all of that had to do with ways in which I suggest actually he's probably being misread, and a lot of that is related to free will and the history of free will. So that's actually going to come up here a bit today. It's not an episode on Leibniz. Don't worry if you have no interest in Leibniz. That is not the topic, right? The topic is on free will, but a lot of that research will be relevant to the sorts of things that we're going to talk about here today. So I think the best place to begin is to define our terms. Oftentimes, popular discussions about free will get a little bit sloppy because they're not attuned to all the different sort of philosophical terms and positions, and especially not to the sort of history of ideas in terms of how the discussion evolves over time. So I'm going to do my best here to help draw those things to light in order to clarify the discussion so that we can see what's really at stake. So terms, let's begin with terms. The first term that is most important is determinism. Okay. Now, determinism is not necessarily a position on free choice or free will. By the way, here, maybe I should begin with a little bit of an aside. You'll notice that I pretty consistently actually slip into the term free choice rather than free will. That's actually related to the history of this terminology. The common parlance today is free will. Historically speaking, like based in Latin, it's liberum arbitrium, which is free choice. And the reason that mattered is because the question was whether or not the faculty of will, right, the willing part of you, has the power of contrary choice. And so the question of freedom was really about free choice, contrary choice, the possibilities of alternative choices, not the freedom of the will per se. Anyway, I will try to use free will just because I don't want to throw people with the alternative terminology, but candidly, I'm probably going to slip oftentimes into a discussion of free choice. Okay. Back to where we started. Okay, so determinism. Determinism is not necessarily a position on free will. Determinism is really a position about the nature of the world. So determinism is the view that for whatever reason, The nature of reality is such that things are the way they are and they cannot be otherwise. There are conditions such that whatever transpires could not have gone in a different direction. Now, there are a variety of forms of determinism. Some of the forms of determinism are things like physical determinism. They would suggest that our world is nothing but matter in motion, and it's fully determined by the laws of physics. This includes, of course, your choices, right? You are a meat robot who is just a series of, colliding material, atoms or whatever it may be. And so the things that appear to be thought processes or contrary choices or things like that, those are actually all physically determined. You are basically a very large, elaborate set of string of dominoes that's just falling the way it's always going to fall. And so we might have the illusion that we have, contrary choice. We might have the illusion that we could do otherwise. But ultimately, the nature of reality is such that whatever is going to happen is going to happen. It's all just sort of physically determined by certain laws of motion, matter in motion, physical laws, things like that. That would be physical determinism. Now, that's not the only form of determinism. There are other forms, like you could be a theological determinist. This is someone who believes that perhaps they are believers in some sort of fate, right? They believe that there is a God, and they think that God determines all things in advance exactly as they are supposed to be, and you can't thwart the will of God. Therefore, the conditions that ensure that all things are the way they are and they can't be otherwise is, in fact, the will of God. And now here, again, there are a couple of different questions that emerge here. Is God himself determined? And there are indeed certain forms of theological determinism that would say yes, right? Spinoza, for example, sees God's activities and his operations as just natural extensions of his nature. So you could say that, God doesn't even have free will. So the necessary ground of all things, God himself, just is the way he is. And then he decrees and causes all other things. And because those causes are just natural extensions of his nature, they have to be the way they are, right? So that would be the conditions for it. Alternatively, I suppose you could create the pocket of freedom, which is God himself. God has contrary choice, but we don't. In that case, you would suggest that there is part of reality that has freedom, but it's just God, right? All the rest of us are bound by determinism. There are also psychological determinists, right? So these are folks who want to say, well, when it comes to your choices, these are products of psychological events, but psychological events are such that they couldn't be otherwise. So again, this could be because ultimately you think thoughts or psychological events are purely physically determined. You're just a meat robot again, in which case this psychological determinism would be an extension of the physical determinism that's there. Or it could be some other rationale, such as you think that, all of us, we just do whatever we perceive as good. Our perceptions are sort of woven into the programming that we have. And therefore, for that reason, whatever we perceive as good, well, that's just a natural product of our nature. Me being me and having my perspective and things like that, I would always perceive that as being the best choice. And so I do that. And so it's sort of it's the idiosyncratic nature of me and the limitations of my perception and my presuppositions and things like that inevitably sort of predetermine the perception that I have that leads to the choice that I make. And therefore, for that reason, I would always do that, right? So now we're into a form of psychological determinism. And then there's other things like logical determinism. Logical determinism is a position that actually suggests that every proposition is either true or false. This is based on what logicians call the law of excluded middle. So the law of excluded middle suggests that a proposition is true or false. There is no middle. And so if we said, for example, we took the proposition that Dr. Jacobs will eat breakfast tomorrow, okay? According to the law of excluded middle, that has a truth value. It's either true or it's false. And so there is no middle. And so if we say it's true, then what we have to say is that there must be reasons why it is true. And therefore, there must be sort of predetermined factors about reality that require that I would inevitably or perhaps necessarily choose to eat breakfast tomorrow. And therefore, there isn't really any contrary possibility of contrary choice. And so reality is sort of logically determined. It must be sort of logically determined given the law of excluded middle and its application to future counterfactuals like that. This is actually sort of a logical version of the foreknowledge problem. So this is another form. Sometimes the foreknowledge problem is used to give rise to another form of theological determinism. That is to say, God has foreknowledge of the future. And if God foreknows that you're going to choose to eat breakfast as opposed to not eat breakfast, then there's no possibility of you not eating breakfast because God's infallible. And therefore, it follows that there must be sort of a predetermination, so to speak, of that choice, such that you couldn't do otherwise because God foreknows what is so, and he's infallible, and so on. That's what's in theology known as the foreknowledge problem. And so if you were to move, say, from foreknowledge to the conclusion that you don't have free will because God has foreknowledge, that would be a form of theological determinism. Logical determinism is very much like that. It's basically the foreknowledge problem, but without God. So anyway, all of this is to say is that there are a variety of forms of determinism. But regardless of the reason, the determinist believes that there are reasons, there are factors, there are explanations, there are something, right? There's something about the nature of reality that requires that things are the way they are and they cannot be otherwise, okay? So that is determinism. Now, obviously, when applied to free will, you have the result that your choices are inevitable. That if you choose A over B, or you choose breakfast over not breakfast, whatever it is, that choice, for whatever reason, is necessarily that, right? It cannot be otherwise. Again, explanation could be because you're a meat robot, physical laws, could be because of psychological factors, psychological determinism, could be because God foreknows it, theological determinism. It could be because of God's decrees, another form of theological determinism, and so on. But determinism would, applied to free will, mean that your choices are such that they cannot be otherwise. Okay, so that's our first term, determinism. Now, the next term that's really important to understand is incompatibilism. Okay, so incompatibilism, what is it talking about, right? What is the part, what is the thing that's in view here that is somehow incompatible? The incompatibilist suggests that free will, properly defined, and determinism are incompatible. Now, the common sense assumption, this should be relatively intuitive. The average sort of man on the street presumption about free will is that free will means that you make certain choices, but you could choose otherwise, right? Like that's sort of the man on the street understanding of free will, very basic. So we can see why the incompatibilists would say that free will and determinism are incompatible. My goodness, I can't speak today. Why? Well, because determinism says that reality is such that things can't be otherwise. Free will says your choices are such that they could be otherwise. Obviously, those two positions are mutually exclusive. They are incompatible. Now, an incompatibilist does not necessarily show his hand in terms of whether he advocates determinism or free will. Incompatibilism merely says you have to choose, right? Either determinism is true or free will is true, but not both. And there are two types of incompatibilists for that reason. And it's based on that choice. The hard determinist is an incompatibilist, okay? So a hard determinist is one who says, yes, determinism is true for whatever reason. There are physical determinists, psychological determinists, theological determinists, logical determinists, all of the above determinists, whatever, right? Reason doesn't matter. But they suggest that reality is such that things are the way they are and they can't be otherwise. And that includes your choices. Therefore, you do not have free will, okay? Anyone who takes that position is a hard determinist. Now, you might say, well, is there a soft determinist? The answer is yes. We'll get to that. But that's a hard determinist. You do not have free will. Now, The alternative is a libertarian. Now, don't get confused here. This is not libertarian in the political sense, although there's a semantic tether there. A libertarian in the free will discussion means that you have the power of contrary choice. Okay, so this is an incompatibilist who says, yes, determinism and free will are not compatible, and free will is real. Okay, so determinism is false. You do have free will, meaning you make choices in such a manner that they could be otherwise. Now, there's a couple of different things that are sort of the key markers of libertarian freedom. The one is what is known as the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP, principle of alternative possibilities. So PAP basically suggests that when I make a choice, the choice is of such a kind that I could do otherwise. And that is sort of the marker of libertarian freedom. The other thing is that libertarians oftentimes make what's considered or sometimes called a consequence argument, right? So the concern here is that I am responsible for my choices. And so the consequence argument basically suggests that if there are conditions that precede my choice, and those conditions that precede my choice are such that they determine my choice, such that I couldn't choose otherwise, then I'm not responsible for my choice. So if, for example, let's just say that my physical makeup, we'll advocate physical determinism for a second. My physical makeup is such that my choice would be P over Q. And given that physical makeup, it's impossible that I would ever choose, not P, given the physical realities that are at work within me. Then the fact of the matter is my physical makeup arises out of conditions that precede any choice on my part. I'm conceived by my parents. That's what sets in motion my genetic and physical makeup. And that genetic and physical makeup is what determines my choices. Therefore, my choices are not really in my control. As a consequence, they are not, my doing. I am not responsible. I am just really my actions are just an effect of who I am. And who I am is something that's entirely outside of my control and preceded any sort of choices on my part. Therefore, I can't be held culpable. I'm not responsible. So that's sort of the consequence argument. So anytime somebody sort of takes this position which says, look, in order for me to be morally culpable, morally responsible, my choices have to originate from me. They have to be my own. And by my own, I don't mean just sort of an outgrowth of who I am, an inevitable outgrowth. I mean, they have to be chosen in such a way that I could have done otherwise. Otherwise, I'm not culpable, right? And so that's one of the things that's always a marker of a libertarian. And also with that, the principle of alternative possibilities, anytime they say a necessary condition for free will is that you choose in such a manner that you could have chosen otherwise. Again, that's always a surefire way of telling if you're dealing with a libertarian. And so if you, dear listener, are sitting here going, no, I think even though there are psychological factors and theological factors and cultural factors and physical factors, I still think when I make choices, I have the capacity to choose otherwise. Well, then you're a libertarian. And candidly, I think most people are sort of intuitively born into the world thinking that they're libertarians. It's only once they start to take a philosophy class or encounter a video online along these lines do they start to toy with determinism. But anyway, be that as it may, or maybe a science class or something like that. But we'll get back to all that shortly. Okay, so far we have, in terms of our terminology, right? We have determinism. Things are such that they couldn't be otherwise, whatever the reason. We have incompatibilism, which says free will and determinism are mutually exclusive. You got to pick, okay? Then you have the hard determinist, who at that fork in the road picks determinism. Determinism is true. You do not have free will. And then the alternative fork in the road is the libertarian. Determinism and free will are mutually exclusive, but you have free will, so determinism is false. Okay. Now, there is one other position here, which is oftentimes the position that is most confusing to people. So we'll try to avoid any line of confusion about this. And this is what's called the compatibilist. Okay. So compatibilism is a position that actually it's relatively new in the history of ideas. I know this is sometimes what I'm about to say is a little bit controversial because a lot of compatibilists would like to find their compatibilism somewhere in ancient or medieval philosophy. I've done, my own sort of in my own published work, I've given my reasons why I think that's nonsense. I don't think you can find it in the ancient or the medieval world. I think it is an invention that really begins to emerge somewhere around the 17th century, and probably late in the 17th century. That's where you start to get compatibilists. So what are compatibilists? First of all, let me say what compatibilism is not. And this goes to one point of confusion. Sometimes the term ends up being picked up in theological circles, because let's be honest, theological circles are the circles where oftentimes people are most emphatically talking about free will, because they run into questions like divine decree, divine foreknowledge, predestination, things like that, things that raise the real issue of free will. And so oftentimes the most robust discussions about freedom take place within theological circles. Oftentimes compatibilism will come up in those circles, and it's in those circles where it tends to be very popular today. So what is it? Well, as I said, there's a fair bit of confusion. One of the bits of confusion that happens oftentimes in theological circles is that people will presume that compatibilism means that free will and divine sovereignty is compatible. Now, here's what I mean. If you're familiar, if you have any sort of exposure to Protestant systematic theology, you'll probably hear mention of Calvinists and Arminians. And this is a discussion specifically related to predestination and the question of whether or not God predestines some to salvation and others to damnation and things like that. We're not going to get too sidetracked in that today. We'll bump into that topic as we are right now, but we're not going to. This is not an episode on predestination. But for that reason, oftentimes there are a lot of folks who are sort of conflicted, right? They don't like Calvinism, but they don't quite like Arminianism. And so they don't know which one to pick and so on. And those sorts of folks who experience ambivalence oftentimes will misuse the term compatibilism to mean that I think somehow God's act of predestination is compatible with my free will, or something like that. That's not what the term means. So that sort of theological tendency to say, I think there's some sort of paradox or some sort of mystery where the sovereignty of God decreeing all things is somehow compatible with my free will, and we don't quite understand it. But I think they are compatible. That's not what compatibilism is talking about. So that's the first misconception we got to get off the table if we're going to properly understand the term compatibilism. Now, the second thing is actually the definition itself, which gets a little slippery, and this is the second point of confusion. So what compatibilism is it actually suggests that free will and determinism are compatible. Let me say that again. It's not suggesting that, you are free, you have the power of contrary choice in the sort of common sense way that people tend to think about it, a libertarian sense. And that somehow that freedom is compatible with divine sovereignty or something like that. Instead, it is saying free will and determinism are compatible. Okay. Now you might hear that and think like, well, how would that even be possible? Because the incompatibilists pointed out a pretty obvious point, which is to say that determinism says things are such that, nothing could be otherwise. And free will, is the view that your choices could be otherwise. So how on earth could you ever say that those two things are compatible? Now here we have to get into the part that I think is most elusive or confusing, really, about compatibilism, which is that compatibilism just redefines freedom. Okay. In other words, compatibilism says, well, let's just pull out of the definition the power of contrary choice. So the compatibilist says, well, free will and determinism are compatible because I don't think we should say that free will involves the power of contrary choice. Let's just say that what free will is that you make a choice and you wanted to make that choice, and nobody put a gun to your head to make you make that choice, and therefore, the choice is free. In other words, what it's doing is it's trying to redefine freedom in a way that you get rid of the contrary possibility. And having gotten rid of the contrary possibility, voila, it's compatible with determinism. It's kind of like saying, well, being a square and being a triangle are incompatible unless we get rid of one of the sides of the square. So if we redefine square to mean a three-sided geometric shape, then square and triangle are compatible. Okay. And I think most people miss that. That's what I think is really sort of deceptive, because a lot of people will hear the fact that it's continuing to advocate for free will and say that, yeah, you do have free will. And it says, oh, okay, so you think I have contrary choice. No, it doesn't. It's redefining free will to get rid of contrary choice. So let's just, in order to illuminate this, let's go back to our physical determinism. We used that as an example before. So let's just say I'm a physical determinist, right? That's the position that I think accurately reflects reality. Reality is just a material sort of, it's a bunch of matter in motion, and that motion is fully determined by the laws of physics. And even though I am a very complex physical organism, the fact of the matter is that all the processes that run through my body and through my brain, and let's say I don't believe in the soul, so I'm just a meat robot, all of those things are predetermined by physical laws. And therefore, even though the complexities of thought and choice, the complexities of psychological phenomena, give the impression that I have self-control and the power of contrary choice and all those sorts of things, at the end of the day, I really am just an elaborate set of falling dominoes. So let's say that I think that's true. Well, a compatibilist would come along and say, well, sure, it is true. There are conditions that precede your choices. The conception of you by your parents ends up setting in motion matter that develops in the ways that become you, and those developments could not be otherwise. And those developments are the things that converge into a series of falling dominoes that ultimately give rise to this choice, so that when you choose to eat breakfast as opposed to not, that choice is inevitable. It could not be otherwise. And that's the case. That's true. So you are determined, but you still have free will because you wanted to do it. And that's the thing that makes you free. So you see what's happening here? This is the part that gets really sort of, I think, misleading for a lot of people. Like I said, they hear that, yes, you wanted to do it. The choice originated from you. Nobody coerced you to do it. And if you wanted to do otherwise, you could have done otherwise. That's the really sort of elusive part, because there's the hidden clause that says, but you being what you are, you could never do otherwise. So this is the part that gets really sort of elusive and a bit confusing for a lot of folks about compatibilism. Compatibilism is determinism, right? In order to really understand the position, that's the thing you have to get. First and foremost, you have to get that a compatibilist is a determinist, full stop. Reality is such, or at least you are such, that your choices could not be otherwise. But the compatibilist wants to say that's okay. And we could still call that free will because nobody put a gun to your head and made you do it, and you wanted to do it. Okay, that's what's called compatibilism. I had mentioned that the incompatibilist hard determinist, I said, is there a soft determinist? And I said, the answer is yes. The compatibilist is the soft determinist. The soft part is just that rather than accepting the term determinist, they try to somehow retain the word freedom, and they try to retain the talk of freedom. But at the end of the day, as I said, really what they're doing is they're redefining freedom in a way that most people intuitively wouldn't call freedom. Like you and I, the average person, like I said, before you study philosophy or get into these sorts of talks, if you ask folks, do you have the power of contrary choice? Most people would say like, yeah, I mean, I presume I do have free will. I presume when I made a choice, I could have done otherwise. I didn't have to do this other thing. That's sort of the intuitive sort of way of thinking about free will. People are intuitively libertarians. They intuitively accept PAP, right? The principle of alternative possibilities. Compatibilism tries to get rid of that. And so that's the thing to really understand when talking about compatibilism. Okay, so there we go. Now we've got our terms, right? We've got determinism, we've got incompatibilism, we've got hard determinism, we've got libertarianism, and we have compatibilism. Let me actually just throw out one more, further point here that I think is another, sometimes terminologically, this gets conflated with something else in the discussion, and that's the word fate. Sometimes people will use fate and determinism interchangeably, and that's actually not the case. And I'll touch on this when I start to talk through some of the history of ideas on this sort of stuff. But suffice it to say that fate is such, let me say this. There are a number of positions throughout the history of ideas that advocate fate, but still believe in free will. Now, this is not a compatibilist move, okay? What they're doing in these positions, which we will talk about, this is something that you see among Stoics, for example, is that they want to say that fate has to do with circumstances, outcomes, right? But they want to suggest that there's still this sort of inner world of how you respond to it. This is actually very important to Stoic ethics. So the Stoics think, if the gods determine that, you're not going to reach the shores of Crete, then do whatever you want. You're not going to reach the shores of Crete. But at the same time, they still think you have free choices. You can try to reach the shores of Crete, or you can accept the determination of the fates and not try, right? So this is an important feature where, the Stoics want to suggest actually that you do have free will. You do have libertarian freedom in terms of how you deal with fate. But at the end of the day, extrinsically, you're sort of in a cosmos where certain things are fated, right? You are bound by circumstances that are sort of hemming you in. How you deal with that hemming is a matter of, of internal freedom. Okay, so we'll get to that. But all that's to say is do not use fate and determinism interchangeably. They are not interchangeable terms. Yes. Some determinists are indeed, I would actually say all determinists are indeed fatalists, but not all fatalists are determinists. Okay, so that's important. All right, so with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the history of ideas related to free will. If we actually look at the ancient pagan world, you see that the libertarian disposition, right? That sort of common sense intuition that says that you have the capacity of contrary choice, you have the power of self-determination, was actually quite ubiquitous amongst the pagan philosophers. There are obvious figures like Aristotle who talk about, our sort of spontaneous capacity of choice paired with reason and things like that. Those are sort of your obvious libertarians who talk in that way. There's also other folks like Cicero, right, who in his worries about fate actually is displaying obvious libertarian tendencies, right? He's worried that if divination is a real thing or if fate is a real thing, that somehow, would undermine the free will of man, which he thinks is essential to justice, right? We hold people accountable because we presume they could do otherwise. And if we suddenly start saying they can't do otherwise, then how would we ever execute justice? So there are certain obvious figures, like Aristotle, like Plato, like Cicero, who are obvious advocates of libertarian freedom. But what's interesting is that even the unlikely candidates tend to show this sort of libertarian tendency. The Epicureans are one example. So it's sort of interesting. The Epicureans are the early atomists, right? So these are the early materialists who believe that basically all things are composed of atoms that just sort of move around and collide and coalesce and disperse and all that sort of stuff. So those are your sort of early materialists. And you would probably think they would be like, well, determinism, right? If it's all just sort of like matter in motion, atoms colliding and things like that, they're your best candidates for advocates of physical determinism. And yet what you find is you find even an odd tendency amongst them to advocate some form of libertarian freedom. So Epicurus, I think it is, introduces the dodge and the swerve. So when people recognize that, hey, if everything is just atoms and they're just whipping around and they're colliding and there's certain laws of motion and things like that, wouldn't that undermine free choice? Wouldn't that undermine morality? Wouldn't that undermine justice and things like that? And so Epicurus suggests that there are certain atoms that perhaps specifically those that are involved in the soul, right? He thought the soul was atomic, that occasionally dodge and swerve, right? Meaning they are not bound by the laws of physics. Now, again, whether or not that actually succeeds in getting you free choice, right, of whether that's an adequate defense of freedom is another matter. But the very fact that that's tried tells you just how much the ancient philosophers were inclined to think, boy, I think we need to actually defend freedom. And I mentioned already that fatalism, fate, is not the same thing as determinism. And I brought up here the Stoics. These are the other sort of surprising advocates, right? Because you would think, okay, well, Stoicism, they are known for fate, right? Stoic fate, right? That was the term, right? The idea that somehow the fates have woven before the throne of Zeus all that is to transpire, in your life. And Stoic ethics is based entirely on the presumption of fate. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that what you find even in the Stoics, these fatalists, you find an advocacy of some form of libertarian freedom. So not Epicurus, sorry, we already talked about Epicurus. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, he actually says at one point that God has given to man this extraordinary power that not even he can control, here referring to the will. And so even here, despite advocating fate, there's this insistence that there is this part of humanity, right, the mind and the will, that is somehow insulated from fate. And that's actually critical to how Stoic ethics work. So the Stoics are known for apatheia, right? Stoic apathy. He's very stoic, right? Is the sort of common parlance for referring to apathy, right? That you don't feel certain things. That's actually not entirely true of the Stoics. I don't want to go too far down this road because my point is not Stoicism, but suffice it to say that the Stoics believe that you have certain animal passions, right? Reactions, animal instincts, pre-volitional, animal responses to perceived goods, right? Desire, and perceived evils, right? Things that you recoil from. And they presume that some of those desires, because they're just animal, right? They're not inherently rational. Some of those desires align with the order of nature and some don't, right? You may have a certain sexual desire for a woman who is your wife, and therefore this is in keeping with the order of nature. You may have a desire for a woman who is not your wife, and now this is contrary to the order of nature. And so the key thing is that the gap between those sort of animal impulses and choice, action, is actually the will, right? Mind, reason, and choice. And so the important thing to cultivate here is that you cultivate apatheia, which in Stoic ethics actually means that sort of gap between the animal impulse and the choice, right? So the idea being that when the animal impulse, the passions rise up in response to something, that you, rather than just acting on it directly, you actually are able to take a beat. You're able to pause. You're able to look at it and assess whether or not it's in accord with the order of nature. And then after that, embrace it if it is in keeping with the order of nature, or reject it if it's not. Now, the relevance here to fate, all of this was extremely relevant to Stoic ethics, not just because they were natural law folks, right? So the sort of thing that I mentioned with desire, right? A woman that is appropriately an object of desire versus inappropriately. On the one hand, there was that sort of dichotomy that they faced, right? Is this choice, is this desire in accord with the order of nature, or is it not? But one of the things that was reflected here was the question of whether or not you embrace fate, right? And so the Stoics believing that you being subordinate to the gods and not really being in control of your fate should be sort of resolved to whatever the gods have determined. And this is an important part of Stoic apatheia, right? The idea that you are not sort of like perpetually pining for things that are outside of your control, that you very much accept and embrace the things that befall you because you just recognize, well, that's part of the order of nature that I'm subordinate to the gods. And so this is where they thought the sort of like grievous demanding that things ought to be a certain way and pining for things that are beyond your control was largely irrational. Now, again, this goes to my point in all of this is just to say that even here where the Stoics accept fate, right? They think that there are certain things that just are outside of your control. If the gods decide that you're not going to make it to Crete, you're not going to make it to Crete. But the fact of the matter is they still believed that you have freedom, that the gods, whatever they can determine about, your circumstances, this inner world of how you respond and how you choose is in your hands. And that's really where freedom resides, in deciding, whether or not you're going to perpetually piss and moan and cry about what the gods have determined or accept it. And accept your place sort of in the order of the cosmos as subordinate to the gods, things like that. So all that's to say is that when you look around at pagan philosophy, you find in the sort of usual obvious characters like Aristotle, this tendency toward a libertarian freedom, but you even then find this sort of clamoring toward, this inclination toward libertarian freedom, even in the unlikely candidates like the materialists, like the Epicureans, and even amongst the fatalists, like the Stoics. So libertarian freedom is largely ubiquitous amongst the pagan philosophers. They're very much in keeping with that sort of intuitive inclination toward the presumption that you have this sort of contrary choice, that this is really the thing that differentiates you from the animals. The animals have these impulses, these passions that just sort of move straight from impulse to action. Whereas you have this capacity of reason to assess, the order of nature and to sort of, observe your own sort of inner passional movements, and then to make certain judgments about whether you should act on those or not. And those judgments reflect a power of choice. This is one of the reasons why Aristotle talks about freedom as, reason paired with spontaneity, right? Reason being that part of you that can assess and analyze, and spontaneity being the part of you that has the capacity to spontaneously act or not act with regard to the sorts of judgments that you're making. So in pagan philosophy, it's ubiquitous. What about in the religious sphere, right? In Judeo-Christianity and Christianity itself? The fact of the matter is that the Christians were big time advocates of free will, especially the early Christians. And there's a variety of reasons for this. One of the reasons that you find across fathers, the early Christian church fathers, East and West, as well as non-church fathers who are early Christian writers, like Tertullian, Origen, one of the things that you find is that there is this insistence that moral culpability requires two things, right? That you, A, know what you ought or ought not to do, and B, that you have the ability to do or not do it. Candidly, I think this is something that every child understands, right? So it's interesting that when kids, anybody who's had kids, right? When kids get caught doing something, you'll notice that the tendency is just reflexively to make an appeal if they don't lie, right? If they know they're caught red-handed, right? Obviously, lying, trying to obscure reality is one tactic. But if they're caught, right, they're caught red-handed, they have a tendency to say, I didn't know, right? In some way, shape, or form. I didn't know. Or I couldn't help it, right? And so this can take a variety of forms, right? This could be like, oh, I mean, my teacher didn't tell me, or, I didn't hear you, right? Or, some form of I didn't know. And then alternatively, like Bobby made me do it, right? Or, something like that, right? They try to come up with a way to suggest that either my knowledge of right and wrong was somehow impeded, right? Or if I know I can't get rid of that, like I know that you said to do it, right? Then I need to come up with some circumstance that forced my hand. Because the problem is, if I know what I ought and ought not to do, and my hand was not forced, meaning I have the ability to do or not do, then I'm morally responsible for what I did. And so it's interesting. That's something, no child is taught that, right? They just sort of come out of the womb. The second they become moral active agents, that's just intuitively there. And the fact of the matter is that never goes away. Even as adults, we end up doing the same sorts of things. It gets more sophisticated, but we still do the same sorts of things. Officer, I didn't see, I didn't see, the speed limit sign, or, there was a tree obscure. How could anybody possibly, read that? The sign's too small, or it's dark out. It needs to be illuminated, right? There's all of those sorts of different ways of going through, that type of excuse is I didn't know, right? That somehow my ability to be held responsible for knowing that has been impeded. And then alternatively, if I did know, there's some sort of coercive forcing of the hand, right? I look, you got to understand, I am late for my kid's basketball game, and I have such a frayed relationship with my kid. I'm afraid of what it does. In other words, you're trying to come up with an external coercive sort of thing, or when we start to make appeals of a certain kind that says, like, I was on medication, right? The medication, it impeded my judgment, or I was sleep deprived, right? Something like that. I hadn't eaten in a long time. I was lightheaded and I wasn't thinking clearly, right? All of those are some form of excuse that says my ability was impeded, right? And that's really like what every sort of legal defense comes down to. That's what every moral defense comes down to. Whenever we try to absolve ourselves morally, we try to make some sort of appeal to either the obscuring of knowledge or the obscuring of the capacity to do or not do. And so one of the things that you find in the early Christian writers is that they are all big advocates of this. They are all insistent that the conditions for moral culpability are that you know what you ought to do, and you have the ability to do or not do. Now, why do they think that we actually have that? Well, there's a variety of reasons. One is that they think that praise and blame only makes sense if you believe in free choice, right? Only makes sense if the person could do otherwise. So when you praise somebody for facing a difficult choice and doing the right thing, the reason you praise them is because you recognize that they didn't have to do that, right? They had the capacity to not do. You also, when you blame somebody for doing something wicked, for example, you blame them because you presume they didn't have to do it, right? They had the capacity to do otherwise. And so what these church fathers end up pointing out is that not only are those the conditions for culpability, but praise and blame themselves all presume a capacity of contrary choice. Now, the reason that's important is because when it comes to the biblical case, right, part of the question would be, well, does the Bible ever tell anyone that they ought to do something or ought not to do something, and then hold them accountable, praising them for doing right or blaming them for doing wrong? And if you've ever opened the Bible, the answer is yes on every single page. And so that's one of the reasons why the church fathers look at that and they're like, yeah, no, like Christianity is very clearly an advocate of free will. The other thing is also a lot of it is related to their theology, related to God, right? So one of the things that they're very insistent about is that God is good. And as good, right, he cannot be the author of evil. Again, I don't want to belabor this particular point because this is getting into the problem of evil question and how evil and God relate to one another. And we're going to do a whole series on that. But suffice it to say that the Christian church fathers unanimously want to say God is not the author of evil. God is not the cause of evil. It would be blasphemous to say that God is good. He cannot be the author of evil. Now, the reason that's important is because what it suggests is that creatures are the author of evil. Evil originates not from the creator, but from the creature. Now, what they also recognize is that if determinism were true, then you end up still having God be the author of evil. You see this, for example, in Irenaeus. He starts to suggest that he suggests at one point he does it via fate, right? But he suggests that if, for example, the choice to do evil was somehow fated, then by God, right? Let's say Adam eating of the tree, right? Adam and Eve falling into sin. If that were somehow fated, then it would be outside of their control. Notice here we have the consequence argument that is from the Libertarians. It would be outside of their control. They would not be responsible for it. So who would be responsible? Well, the one who fated them, which is God, right? And so because God cannot be the author of evil, therefore the choice to sin cannot be fated. And therefore, humans have free will. So Irenaeus makes that sort of argument. And you see that time and again. You see it in Tertullian, you see it in others. Where they consistently come back to the point that suggests that God is not the author of evil. God makes the world good. And then creatures are the ones who introduce evil. Now, this also goes into another distinctive of Christianity, that the Christian narrative itself is unique in terms of its understanding of evil. Again, I'm going to try to resist not going down the road of the problem of evil. We'll talk about all of this when we do that series. But suffice it to say that when considering the nature of good and the nature of evil in the ancient world, there's really only sort of three options that are on the table. Amongst the ancient, one option is to suggest that evil is an illusion, right? So this is sort of the pantheist option. You find this in people like Heraclitus. So Heraclitus suggests that the world is properly organized by the logos. That's, obviously the term for the rational, divine ordering principle of nature. And the world being orderly, that means that all that happens is in accord with wisdom. And yes, men have a tendency to say that this is an evil and this is a good. But Heraclitus suggests that's really just sort of an expression of what we find pleasant and unpleasant, desirable and undesirable. This is really just sort of our own limited perspective. But if we could see the world from the divine perspective, all is good. Right. So that's one way of dealing with it. You suggest that really everything is orderly and good and has its proper place. And even though we dislike certain things, we're really sort of expressing sort of preferential, like pleasure and pain, like and dislike. We're not talking about morality per se. From the divine perspective, all is good. This would also be the other, pantheist perspective, which suggests that God is above good and evil and that good and evil are illusions ultimately and so on. But so that's one explanation. You get rid of evil and you suggest that evil is ultimately some sort of an illusion, which is more perspectival than it is real. Now, the alternative solution is metaphysical dualism, where you suggest, no, look, we all know that evil is real. And anybody who says that evil is not real is crazy. So they want to accept that, yes, good and evil are real things. And so metaphysical dualism suggests they are two equal and opposite principles. So this can be expressed in a variety of ways. Sometimes in the ancient world, this was expressed as two different sort of features of reality. Like, for example, matter is evil. That's the thing that confuses and throws about passions and drags us down. So matter is an evil, distorting, corruptive principle. And spirit, right, the spiritual realm, right? Spirit is good. So that's one version of it. Another version is that you have warring gods, right? So you have one God who is good and one God who is evil, and they're at perpetual war, and we're sort of caught in the middle of this battlefield. But metaphysical dualism, as an explanation for evil, ends up treating evil, good and evil, as sort of two equal and opposite principles that are just sort of facets of the world, colliding, as it were. Christianity is unique. Judaism and Christianity are unique in this way because what they suggest is that reality as a whole, not just spirit, not just matter, all of it, that reality as a whole is good, that being is good, right? And yes, and that's not just moral goodness, right? Like that's just being in general. So plants are good. Now they're not morally good because they're not moral agents, but they are good in a certain sense. And so Christianity is the religion, Judaism and Christianity, advocate the idea that all of creation begins good, that all of creation is good, right? Notice that in Genesis, God declares things good before you ever get moral beings, right? That being itself is somehow good. And evil is not an equal and opposite principle. Evil is inherently parasitic. And even that's probably too strong, because a parasite, it's a substantive reality. It is a privation, or it is a twisting, or it is a distorting. In other words, it's not an additive property. It's somehow a subtractive property. And so we might think of it this way, right? The goodness of an eye, its ontology, the goodness of an eye has to do with being properly formed such that it is able to see, right? There's a connection between what it is, that it's an eye, and its teleological end, to be able to see. And evil to an eye, here we don't mean moral evil, this would be a physical evil, but evil to an eye would be any sort of distortion that, makes it difficult to see, right? That induces blindness or an obscurity to sight. That's not an additive property. It's a subtractive or distorting property. And we'll, again, when we get to the problem of evil, we'll walk through some of the reasons why that Christians thought this is true of, virtue and vice, right? Virtue is an acquisition of something positive. Vice is an absence of virtue, and things like that. But suffice it to say that Judaism and Christianity took the unique position that all of being, all of reality is good. There isn't an evil principle to it. And what evil is any sort of like retrograde distortion or twisting or privation of the sort of innate goodness of reality. That was a unique position. Now, the reason that's important is because when you start to get into the Christian narrative and you suggest that, right, you suggest that evil is not part of the sort of original order. It's not part of the fabric of reality. It's not an inevitability of matter. It's not, a product of a second god that we call the devil or something like that. And instead, what you're suggesting is that the order of nature is inherently good, and then it gets twisted and distorted. The question is, well, who twists it? How does it get twisted? How does it get distorted? If it's not an inevitability, if it's not just a sort of necessary byproduct of matter, then how does that happen? Well, the Christian narrative has always been free creatures, rational creatures, these high godlike beings who have this unique capacity of free choice are the ones who twist and distort it. Why? Right? Because we have this unique capacity. And I want to just I don't want you to miss this because this is so odd. We have the unique capacity to look on ourselves, to sort of step back, as it were, and examine ourselves, our own inner workings, our own world, make judgments about what we are, why we are, how we ought to be, and then choose whether to be that or not. That is weird, right? Nothing else in all of nature does that. Bees don't sit there and reflect on, what am I? I'm a bee. For what purpose do I exist? And for what purpose do I have the stinger? And how ought I exist? And do I want to exist in that manner? Bees don't do that. Dogs don't do that. Plants don't do that. Only human beings and angels do that sort of thing. That is only rational beings have the capacity to sort of step back and do that sort of meta-examination. And then in the light of that meta-examination, decide whether it wants to operate in accord with nature or not. That's weird, right? That's so incredibly unique, but we're so accustomed to it, I think it's oftentimes lost on us. But the fact of the matter is that capacity is the capacity that, according to Judaism and Christianity, is what opens the door in a good creation for the possibility of twisting, right? For the possibility of privation, because God makes a good reality, right? Something that is through and through good. In the case of man, very good. But within this order of reality, there are these very godlike beings, rational beings, who have the capacity to make choices about whether or not they want to conform to reality or not. And those that choose to not end up twisting and distorting reality, and it has major ramifications. So all of that is to say that the early Christian church fathers recognize this, right? They recognize this unique position of Christianity relative to all the other positions on good and evil in the ancient world. And for that reason, they become, again, big advocates of free choice, right? So part of it is the biblical praise and blame that they think that biblical morality and future judgment and things like that obviously presume a power of contrary choice, presume free will. They are advocates in terms of evil, the idea that God is not the author of evil. They are insistent that God is not. That gets you to the Christian narrative, which suggests that it is within our capacity to do or not do. And if we were fated, if we were determined, then God, being the author of our determined natures, would be the author of evil, but he is not. And so for that reason, they thought it was very clear that Christianity is a religion that believes in free will. And then there's other arguments that you find in the fathers as well. So, for example, some of those have to do with the image of God. Some of those have to do with arguments from perfection. I'll begin with the argument from perfection. Basil of Caesarea, for example, he makes the case that suggests that it is obviously an elevated capacity, right? A perfection, if you're going to use the medieval term, this sort of higher power, right? This higher capacity that sets us apart from the animals. The fact that we have the ability to reason and to choose is something that is a capacity that is above that of the irrational beasts. And so Basil suggests that that we wouldn't be able to have this sort of superior capacity unless God had it. Because if God doesn't have it, but we have it, then we would have some capacity that's superior to God's own abilities. And so he suggests that that's absurd. And so the only reason that this superior capacity could exist in us is because, it exists in God. And this is also where you get into the image of God argument, right? So one of the things that's presumed here is that God himself has free will, and therefore we as images of God, which was something that was tied in with the higher nature, we too have free will. Just to offer a quick aside on the image of God. Yes, in terms of how the early church fathers understand the image of God, they understand it to largely reflect our spiritual nature. So the very fact that we have this sort of like relatively immaterial, immortal, spiritual side to us, right? We have this spiritual nature. And also with that, we have capacities of reason and free will. That is the part that images God, right? That is the part of us that reflects the image of God. Now, this actually goes into another thing that is relatively unique. I'd mentioned that the view of good and evil amongst the Christians in the ancient world was unique. Their view that God has free will is actually also pretty unique in the ancient world. So it's interesting because what you find is a lot of talk of will in reference to God amongst the pagans, but it's not obvious that they believe that there is self-determination. That's actually the term that ends up being used more often than not for choice. So there's this mention of will, but it's harder to find instances of choice or self-determination in reference to God with regard to the pagans. And that creates this kind of ambiguity about whether or not God has free will. Plato, it does seem like maybe there's some room in his Timaeus creation myth that maybe God has certain capacities of freedom. He certainly anthropomorphizes God as desiring certain things and looking about for a model of the world and choosing to make the world and things like that. But in later Middle and Neoplatonists, God seems to be just a first principle that sort of radiates and just involuntarily emanates the world. Aristotle's God contemplates himself. So he clearly is a mind who has reason, but it's not obvious that God's really making choices, right? He produces the world almost like an appendage, like matter is just sort of reacting to him, and it inevitably becomes what it becomes. With the Stoics, I mentioned fate. Well, the Stoics are pantheists, right? So they actually understand the world, the cosmos, and God to be one and the same thing. So what happens is there's this primordial fire, which is God. And then God begins to sort of manifest his nature in differential properties, which ends up producing creatures. And so in some ways, the sort of unfolding part of the reason why fate is the case is because the divine nature is what it is. So it unfolds the way that it unfolds. And so it's not obvious that God is necessarily making choices in Stoicism either. And so it's really difficult to nail down any sort of conception of divine freedom amongst the pagans. It's definitely up for grabs. If it's there, it's subtly there, and it's definitely wrestling against the idea that God is just sort of a first principle that inevitably just does what he does. It's only in Christianity that you really start to get this very clear advocacy of God having free choice. And so this is some place where the Christians do really push back against the pagan concept that God doesn't have freedom. As I mentioned, Basil suggests that obviously God has freedom because we have freedom, and we wouldn't be able to have this superior capacity unless God had it, right? So you see things like that. You see things like in John of Damascus, him talking about how God clearly has the capacity to do certain things he doesn't do, like destroy the world right now. And he's not doing that. So he must have the power of choice, right? You see in people like Gregory of Nyssa, this mention of choice with regard to divine activity, the divine activity of creation. So Christianity had always pushed back and rejected the idea that God is just sort of an impersonal principle, right? That God just sort of inevitably radiates the world or emanates the world or something like that. They were always insistent that God actually does make choices about how to express his nature. And I'm not going to get into an aside about the essence energies distinction, but suffice to say, in the Eastern Church Fathers, this is a big reason for the essence energies distinction, the idea that God is by nature a certain way, right? His essence. But he makes choices about how to articulate or express that nature, the energies. People like Aristotle don't make that distinction. They distinguish essence and energies, but they think God just is energia, right? So he inevitably just does what he does. It was a Jewish and then Christian Alexandrian Jewish, Philo of Alexandria, Jewish and then Christian notion that God makes choices, right? That he's personal, that he shows up, that he speaks, that he makes choices about how to interact with us, that he makes choices about how to create the world and things like that. And so the very fact that that's there in Christianity, again, indicates a further advocacy amongst the early Christians for free choice, right? That they think it is a religion that inherently advocates free choice. Now, clearly there are elements of the religion, specifically its talk of foreknowledge and its talk of predestination, that created problems, right? Challenges for free will, challenges that the church fathers had to wrestle with. Now, I would point out three things here. The first is that the very fact that these are seen as challenges to be overcome, again, is its own proof that the church fathers believed they must advocate free will, right? That they look at this and they suggest, well, however we interpret foreknowledge, however we interpret predestination, it can't violate the Christian commitment to free will. That in itself, the fact that that is the approach, is its own proof that there is a concern and advocacy in the early Christians for free will, that they saw it as inherently part of their religion. Second, I would say this. One of the things that's interesting is that when we look at the discussions of foreknowledge, one of the things that you find is that they actually see foreknowledge as proof of free will. So this is counterintuitive, right? Because most people, when they consider foreknowledge, they look at it and they wonder, I wonder if that undermines the possibility of freedom, right? If God foreknows that I'm going to choose to eat breakfast tomorrow, doesn't that mean that I don't have free choice about whether to eat breakfast tomorrow? But in certain figures like Augustine of Hippo, for example, in Book 5 of City of God, where he's dealing with Cicero, who Cicero is freaking out, right? He's freaking out about, he does this in De Fado and then also in his treatise on divination. He's worried about whether or not divination or, foreknowledge of the future somehow undermines freedom. And the reason he's concerned about that is because he wants to suggest that if we don't have freedom, then we can't be held morally culpable. Again, this is this whole culpability argument that we talked about earlier. And Augustine's response to this, well, he's got a myriad of responses. One of them is that he suggests that the will is essentially free. And so not even God can make a will that is not free, right? Any more than it can make a square that doesn't have four sides. But one of the things that he also points out with regard to foreknowledge is he points out that foreknowledge indicates that there is something in the will to know, meaning a free choice. And this is a rather sort of savvy, interesting point, because what it suggests is that if what was happening in foreknowledge is fate, right? If it were that God just has determined that I'm going to eat breakfast tomorrow, that would not be foreknowledge, right? It wouldn't be knowledge about my future choice. It would be a self-knowledge. It would be God's knowledge of his own determination. And this is actually Augustine's point, that he suggests that there is some sort of foreknowledge indicates a subject-object relationship, that God knows something about me. And what does he know about me? He knows what I'm going to choose, right? And so this is one of the places where a lot of early Christian writers end up doing something rather unexpected with foreknowledge. Rather than seeing foreknowledge as in some ways undermining freedom, they see it as its own proof of freedom, because it suggests that God knows something about me, which means that there is something to know, right? Namely, my free choice, or a voluntary cause, as Augustine calls it. That's something we'll probably come back to later. And so that's one thing that's also interesting about foreknowledge and how the early Christians deal with it. Another thing is regarding predestination. The church fathers also oftentimes tie it with foreknowledge, and they think that this is a rather important point. They think it's rather important. You can see this in Ambrose of Milan, amongst others. But, where they'd say, well, notice that it's not that God predestines and then foreknows. Those he foreknows, he predestines. That's if you're referring to Paul's talk of predestination in his letter to the Romans. Now, the reason Ambrose thinks this is important is because he suggests that this means that predestination, whatever it means, however that works, is somehow tied with some sort of knowledge of the creature, some sort of knowledge of our own choices and things like that. And that's one of the reasons why predestination in its early forms was really just strongly tethered with foreknowledge, the idea that God foreknows who will be responsive to him and who will resist him and so on. Now, the predestination discussion, its entire history is a very lengthy one, and the discussion gets more and more complicated and sophisticated. This is not an episode on predestination, so I'm not going to go get bogged down on that road. If you're interested in that topic, I would point you to my Substack. I have posted 3 of the 4 parts of a history of predestination, and so I walk through the sort of nuances of that discussion there. For our purposes here, my point is simply this, that the ways in which the early Christians deal with these problems, even though they recognize that there are elements within the religion, foreknowledge, predestination, that raise questions about freedom, their treatment of those topics, first of all, the very fact that they treat those as problems to be overcome is an indication of their advocacy of free will. Second of all, what they have to say about foreknowledge is that they see it as proof of free will. And third, in terms of predestination, they see it as important that foreknowledge plays a role in it. Because notice, if we were to contrast this with fate, the fates who weave something, the fates who weave your destiny before the throne of Zeus in Greek mythology, they don't consult your free will, right? They unilaterally determine what's going to befall you. Whereas the entire point with the Christians is they point out the very fact that Paul talks about foreknowledge in tandem with predestination indicates something synergistic, meaning God doing something dynamic, some sort of interplay with his creatures, which is not what fate does. And so again, they see even in predestination and foreknowledge, proof of the Christian advocacy of free will contrasted with the pagan views. So all that's to say that Christianity, the commitment to free will, libertarian freedom, amongst the early Christians was ubiquitous. So it was extremely common to advocate libertarian freedom amongst the pagans, amongst the Jews, and amongst the Christians. It's not to say that nobody in the ancient world ever sort of held to an odd view of fate, or some sort of position that would undermine free will or something like that. Obviously, that was there. You had those, but those were the outliers, right? The sort of mainstream philosophical positions amongst the pagans were certainly advocates of freedom, amongst Judaism, advocates of freedom, and then amongst Christianity, advocates of freedom. And what you start to see is in these sort of early conversations, you see these sort of main contours of how freedom is understood. One issue that you see here is you see that freedom is understood as self-determination. That's actually the pretty consistent term, right? The Christians refer to this as self-determination. Pagan philosophers also refer to self-determination or the things that rely upon us, right? And so here the point is to differentiate sort of the nexus of causes that don't rely upon us to those things that are within our control or within our power to determine, right? And so this is, again, like determinism might apply to certain things like the laws of physics for rock falling or something like that. But choice is not just sort of there. It's not just sort of part of the nexus of determined causes. That's what relies on us, right? That's what is self-determined as opposed to extrinsically determined. So that's one of the things. With that, you also see this talk of reason paired with spontaneity. This is what Aristotle talks about. So the idea that we have this capacity, this unique capacity that I talked about, that unlike a dog, we can sort of step back and we can engage in this type of metacognition where we observe the happenings around us. We observe the happenings within ourselves. We can reason about the choices before us. And then ultimately, rather than sort of a determined sort of chain of dominoes, we have this capacity of free spontaneity by which we are able to self-determine in whatever way we might choose, as opposed to just sort of the inevitable falling domino effect. So that's the reason paired with spontaneity. And this is also reflected then in the thing that I've already mentioned, which is the presumption you find in so many church fathers, where moral culpability presumes that you have knowledge of what you ought or ought not to do, and you have the capacity to do or not do it. Again, a consistent feature of freedom as understood amongst the ancients. And then with this, there was also the presumption that it wasn't just moral culpability, right? That was, free will was an essential feature of moral culpability, but also of justice, right? So things like, you see this in the Christians where they talk about praise and blame, right? That people are praised or blamed according to, and rewarded and punished according to, ultimately, in terms of final judgment, according to their deeds, because they have the capacity to do or not do. That's what makes them culpable or responsible for that particular course of action. But you also see this amongst the pagans too, right? So Cicero is worried that justice itself is not just a training mechanism. Justice itself exists in order to reward people for making good choices and to punish them for making bad choices. Again, having the same sort of flavor of culpability that we find in so much of Christian thinking as well. And so those are sort of the core elements of how freedom was understood in the ancient world. Like I said, there's going to be additional elements that sort of come into play that we'll touch on regarding the free will discussion. But at its base, right, at its sort of core, this ancient discussion is really sort of floating in those sets of commitments. And I think those are largely pretty intuitive for people. As I said, I think most of us sort of, not most of us, that's softening it. And I don't know why I would soften it. I think all of us come into the world with this inherent understanding that we have the capacity to assess the things before us, the choices before us, to make choices. And one of the reasons that we sort of glom onto defenses of I didn't know or I couldn't help it is because we also intuitively understand that moral culpability is based on those things, the knowledge of what you ought to do or ought not to do and the ability to do it or not do it. I think it's just sort of it's there in woven into our innate intuitive understanding of the world and of ourselves and of the exercise of reason and free will. There we go. That's sort of a little bit of the background. We've got some terms, we got a little bit of history here. And with that, now we get into the question of, well, Dr. Jacobs, what are you? Are you a determinist? Are you an advocate of libertarian freedom? Are you a compatibilist, etc.? I think anybody who's probably listened to me for any amount of time, they would not be shocked to find out that I am indeed an advocate of libertarian freedom. And I am. Ta-da. I am an advocate of libertarian free will. Now, why? Why, Dr. Jacobs? Why do you believe in libertarian freedom? Well, there's a couple of different whys that we can take. The one is a theological why, right? You know, as an Orthodox Christian, why do you believe in free will? And that's sort of like a theological, confessional type question. And then there's the philosophical why, right? What is the case to be made for it? So I think the theological one is probably obvious from the things I've already touched on. I don't need to rehash it. I am convinced that, just from a biblical perspective, I think the Church Fathers' argument is sound, right? The idea that the biblical text presumes the conditions of culpability, that you know what you ought to do and you have the ability to do or not do. I think it clearly exercises this in terms of people who have access to the law in the Old Testament, for example. So in this sense, they've been told directly by God. But I think you also find it in the New Testament with people like St. Paul, who talks about the law written on the hearts, talking about conscience, accusing or else excusing and things like that. So I think biblically speaking, the idea that humanity has some access through our moral faculties, through conscience, through our understanding of the world and our ability to examine the natural order using reason and things like that. It presumes that we have at least some sort of baseline understanding of right and wrong. And then with that, it presumes that we have the choice to obey or not obey. And then, as the Church Fathers point out, it praises those who obey and it blames those who don't, which I think, again, presumes some sort of free will. And I think everything about rewards and punishment and future judgment and all of that stuff, again, I think it is a religion that on every single page presumes free will. And without going into, again, the details about foreknowledge and predestination, suffice to say that I think neither of those doctrines actually undermines freedom. I think the Church Fathers are quite right to look at those doctrines and see in those doctrines a freedom as well. See in those doctrines something that actually sets Christianity, again, apart from its the pagan advocates of fate, and weaves into both the concept of foreknowledge and the concept of predestination, the fact that God works synergistically with creatures, that he gives to us genuine freedom, he honors that freedom, and he works out his plans in dialogue with our own choices, as opposed to unilaterally sort of weaving a fate, as it were, for us before the foundations of the world without any reference to our own choices. So from a biblical perspective, I think the Church Fathers are quite right in their cases there. Also from the problem of evil perspective, again, whole series coming up on the problem of evil. But I'll say this, I am a big advocate of the idea that we are not wrong to see in the world both good and evil. And this is one of the reasons why, when looking at the problem of evil, I have an objection, because I believe that evil is a feature of our world. I have an objection to any philosophy, any position that would undermine the reality of evil. And so that's where I have an objection to anything that makes it an illusion, right? So a form of pantheism that would end up doing that and making God above good and evil, and making good and evil just sort of pleasure and pain preferences of our own. So I reject all that. I also, for this reason, think that even though the atheist is right to bring up the problem of evil as a very important problem and issue to be looked at and engaged seriously, which I do engage it quite seriously, I think the atheistic use of it is incoherent, because I don't think good and evil have any place within the atheistic world. If our world is just sort of random matter in motion happenstance, good and evil in the moral sense, in a transcendent moral sense, don't exist. We can talk about what we find pleasurable or painful, what we find desirable and undesirable, but we can't talk about moral evil, not in the way like a theist would. And so I think the atheist conclusion ends up being incoherent because it's basically advocating evil as real and then coming to a conclusion that makes evil not real, right? It becomes self-referentially incoherent. And truthfully, I think determinism does the same thing. So if determinism were true, I don't think moral properties would exist. And I think this is evident in the fact that, for example, when we look at animals, we recognize that animals do not behave in moral ways, right? I've used this before when I've talked about anthropology, that if a dog goes around and randomly humps stuff, you don't think of it as immoral. You might think of it as gross, right? But you don't think of it as immoral. But when a man does that, if he goes around and humps everything that moves, you do think of him as immoral. Well, why? Because you presume that he has A, the knowledge that he ought not to do that, and B, the capacity to do or not do it. And without those, moral culpability doesn't apply. Well, it's not just that moral culpability doesn't apply, it's that moral properties don't even adhere. Animals, irrational animals, plants, for example, these are not actually moral beings. So it's not just that a dog is not immoral for humping things, it's that it's sort of morally neutral. No moral properties adhere in the action of the dog, when it goes around and humps random things. It's the very fact that you have reason and free will that causes, that brings to bear on the act some sort of moral quality. So the fact of the matter is, if determinism were true, I don't think there would be any moral properties in the world. So once again, from the problem of evil perspective, I'm an opponent of any view that undermines the reality of evil. And so this is why I oppose pantheism of a kind that rejects evil as illusory. It's why I oppose atheism. And it's also why I would oppose determinism, because I think determinism would ultimately undermine the reality of moral properties. And I think there very much is, evil in our world. So there's the biblical perspective. I'm also, from the perspective of evil, there's that. I'm a believer that evil is real. I think that's a very Christian thing to believe. I think the Bible is quite clear that evil is a feature of our world. And then also with that, I also think the Church Fathers' argument that God would be the author of evil if we didn't have free will is also quite true. If ultimately, I think this is where the application of the consequence argument is quite right. If ultimately Adam and Eve were to eat of the tree and sin because of some sort of innate programming in their nature, and that programming is not a self-programming, it's not self-determination, but it's a God programming, then the fault for eating of the tree would not be their own. The fault would be God's for doing that programming. And so with the Church Fathers, I'm an advocate. God is good, right? He is the good. God is good. He would not, he cannot perpetrate evil. He cannot will evil in any affirmative sense. Again, things that we'll talk about in the context of the Problem of Evil series. But suffice to say that I think it would be blasphemous and contrary to all Christian doctrine and truth to make God the author of evil. And yet to suggest that we don't have free will is to do exactly that. And so I think from the perspective of evil, I think that's the case. I think also it would just undermine the entire Christian narrative. So as I pointed out, the Christian narrative in its explanation of evil is unique relative to other ancient views. The illusory view, metaphysical dualism view, Christianity and Judaism stand out with this idea that the world is originally good and then it gets distorted by, drumroll, rational free beings. And so I don't think without free will, you actually have the Christian narrative. So there's all that sort of stuff without even bringing in the Church Fathers. But definitely once you bring in the Church Fathers, the fact of the matter is there's a very, very clear consensus across all Church Fathers, and including amongst people who aren't Church Fathers like Tertullian and Origen and things like that. It is ubiquitous amongst, the early Christian writers that we have free will, that we have this power of contrary choice, that we are the authors of evil, God is not, and so on and so forth. And so from that reason, as an Orthodox Christian, who isn't just some sort of like, I'm not a sola scriptura, Bible alone Protestant Christian, but I'm actually an Orthodox Christian. I am an advocate of, following the consensus of the Church Fathers. And I think it is exceedingly clear that the Church Fathers are unanimous in their advocacy of libertarian freedom. So on a confessional front, there's all sorts of reasons for why I think Christianity inevitably is driven in that direction. Now, I will say here, and again, I don't want to go into too long of an aside because I don't want to get us off track. I do know that some folks might be wondering, well, is that true of all Christian traditions? I mean, I've heard of Calvinists, and don't Calvinists deny free will and advocate determinism of some form or another? That's what I've heard. And the answer is like, no, not really. Again, I don't want to get too far off track on this, but here's what I'll say on that. I will say that if you look at the work of Richard Muller, who is one of the foremost authorities in the world on 16th, 17th century orthodoxy, you look at his work on free will amongst the Reformed. You also look at work coming out of the Netherlands, people like Willem van Asselt and Yves Dekker. What you'll see a consistent trajectory that the 16th and 17th century Reformed, even the Reformed, right, even the so-called Calvinists, were advocates of free will and considered it blasphemous to make God the author of evil. So you find a lot of this. Yes, when it came to salvation, they thought man did not have the power of will to sort of will his salvation. But did they believe that man had a capacity of contrary choice and free will? The answer is really quite clearly yes. And so it's only later, again, much later, once you get to people like Jonathan Edwards, that you start to get soft determinism. That's where you start to get compatibilism. But what's interesting, again, I'd point you to Richard Muller's work on this. Richard Muller points out that the reception of Jonathan Edwards' thought, in Europe, indicates that actually most people recognize that Jonathan Edwards' soft determinism was actually divergent from Reformed tradition. It was an innovation. Anyway, all of that's to say is that even amongst the most sort of like determinist, the folks that are thought to be determinists, like the Reformed and the Calvinists, historically speaking, the majority of that tradition, at least at its origin in the 16th, 17th century, was still an advocate of libertarian freedom. It just wasn't an advocate that we had the freedom to save ourselves, but they still thought we had freedom. And so what I would say is that it's actually highly innovative and idiosyncratic when you start to get Christians like Thomas Hobbes, who are overt determinists, or Henry Holmes Kames, people like this. You do start to, during the Enlightenment, as determinism is starting to come into vogue, determinism, hard determinism, soft determinism is starting to come in vogue with certain figures. You do start to get Christians who are like full-throated, like, yes, I'm a determinist. But I would say that historically speaking, is highly, highly innovative in the history of Christianity. So I say that just in order to point out that I do not think the advocacy of libertarian freedom is sort of like uniquely Eastern Orthodox, my own tradition. It's clearly there in Orthodoxy, yes, but it's also there in Catholicism. I think it's there in, the 16th, 17th century Reformed scholastics. It's clearly there in the Lutheran scholastics. It's there in the Arminians. So all that's to say is I think the clear majority of all traditions, all Christian traditions, lends toward a libertarian view of free will. And it's only these sort of very late in modernity sort of idiosyncratic pockets that start to pop up. And I do think some of that is starting to be popularized now. The popularity of Jonathan Edwards via people like John Piper and things like that has started to produce a lot of soft determinists who call themselves Calvinists. But historically speaking, that's highly innovative. And I don't mean just highly innovative relative to, the consensus of all of historical Christianity. Again, pointing the work of Muller and others, it's highly innovative relative to even the Reformed tradition. So all this to say is that from the theological confessional side, that's why I would identify as an advocate of libertarian freedom. But is there any philosophical reason, Dr. Jacobs, why I should actually hold to this view? And I would say absolutely. Some of those we've already touched on. So this is where this sort of divide between theology and philosophy is really very much an artificial divide. It's a divide that starts to happen in modernity and has only grown even more exaggerated in the contemporary academy. Suffice to say, in the ancient world, theology and philosophy were basically the same thing. I mean, once Aristotle finishes going through his definition of metaphysics, in book 1, he ends up concluding that it's an examination of causes. He traces that to a first cause. Ultimately, that's God. And so he concludes that metaphysics is theology. And similarly with, Socrates, when he defines philosophy, he actually says, what is it? He says, wise you may not call them, for that name belongs to one, which is God, obviously. But they are lovers of wisdom. So according to Socrates, or Plato, if you prefer, a philosopher is one who loves God. And that definition ends up being echoed in later church fathers, like Chrysostom talks about Basil of Caesarea deciding to live the life of a philosopher, meaning a monk. And so in the ancient world, there isn't really this sort of divide between this guy's a philosopher over here and that guy's a theologian over there. The philosophers, people like Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, they're all engaged in theology, right? They're philosophizing about the nature of the world and where things come from and the nature of man and how ought I to live and all that. It was inherently, religious. And sometimes in modernity, there was this attempt to sort of divide it and say, well, Christianity and Judaism, that was based on revelatory text, right? So theology deals in revelations, whereas, divine special revelations, whereas philosophy deals in, natural revelation, the order of nature and reason and all the rest. Yes. But that's actually, again, that's highly artificial. It's a very forced distinction there, because the Stoics believed in signs. So you'll have certain Stoics. They advocate looking about to see is the logos hinting, right, that it's time for you to go, or that you shouldn't do this thing or whatever else. They believed in signs. They believed in oracles, which are all forms of special revelation. So that doesn't really work. Plato or Socrates talks about, going and making sacrifices to certain deities. So again, this entire idea that somehow, it's like, well, natural revelation, special revelation, or something like that, it doesn't really work. That's more of sort of an academic, division of faculties, right? Meaning faculties like internal to the academy, that starts to happen in modernity and then gets exacerbated in subdisciplines and specializations and things like that today. But I mean, you look at the history of ideas, like, I don't know, is Thomas Aquinas a philosopher or a theologian? Okay, well, if you're looking at the history of ideas, he's certainly relevant. If you're looking at philosophy of religion, he's certainly relevant, right? Like, if you're doing theology, he's certainly relevant. So, I mean, I don't think these divides really work. Now, the reason I bring that up is to say that I actually do think the sorts of reasons that have been forwarded are not just theological reasons, they're philosophical reasons. So when I look at, with the church fathers, these arguments that talk about our moral intuitions, the fact that we sort of come into the world and we just sort of intuitively know that, that knowledge of what you ought to do and the ability to do or not do is sort of inherent to moral culpability. I think that's a philosophical argument as well as a theological one. Theological being just that it comes out of the church fathers, and they think that's reflected in the biblical text and in Christianity. But I think that's actually a sound philosophical case being made there. And similarly, you could say the same thing about the argument that God is not the author of evil. Obviously, the church fathers have theological commitments, biblical commitments related to maintaining that. But obviously, Plato too thinks that God is the good, right? So it's not as if arguing that that God is the good and therefore can't be the author of evil, and for that reason we can't be fated. We must have free choice, and we're therefore the origin point of evil. That can be just as much a philosophical argument as a theological argument. But be that as it may, let's take some more overt philosophical considerations. One of those I've already touched on, and I touched on it in the theological context, and that's that I think that moral properties cease to adhere if you don't have the power of contrary choice. I talked about the fact that dogs we don't identify as evil, and in fact, it's not just that we don't identify them as evil. They're clearly morally neutral. The moral properties that adhere in the actions of a man as contrasted with a dog is specifically related to the capacities of knowledge and free will. And so I think one of the fact that we end up having these sorts of moral intuitions is key to telling us that we also have free will. So anybody who has listened to me argue for realism, for example, and I don't know, maybe you're just coming across this podcast now, so you haven't seen it. I would point you to two places, right? The one is the most important question, where I go through the history of ideas and I talk about the distinction between realism and nominalism. And I explain why I think that's sort of the central divide in the history of ideas. But then also in the episode, The Case for Realism, I go through some of the reasons why I'm an advocate of realism. And in that case for realism, one of the things that I work through is I talk about properly functioning faculties arguments. So I'm definitely an advocate of the idea that any sort of philosophical position that we're going to embrace, we really need to sort of start with a soft foundationalism. We need to accept that we need first principles. We can't do the Cartesian thing where we're hard foundationalists and we build up from nothing. I make the case in The Case for Realism why I don't think that works. And in similar ways, I've made the case that I don't think skepticism works for the same reason. In other words, it wants to sort of demolish reason, but at the same time, it then wants to use reason to do that, right? And so it ends up in this self-referential incoherence. And so I'm an advocate of the fact that we need first principles. And from those first principles, we can start to build. But those first principles have to be, on the one hand, they have to be livable. And on the other hand, they have to be coherent, right? They have to, in some ways, honor the workings of reason. And so here, because I'm not a hard foundationalist or a skeptic, which I think those are just sort of two sides of the same coin, I start with the assumption that my faculties are functioning properly, unless I have a very good reason to think otherwise. I start with the assumption that my faculties are functioning properly. And with that, I also presume that they are aimed at truth-telling. Now, the reason that's important is because what that means is that I have to, in some ways, examine what my faculties are telling me. This is part of the case that I made for realism, where I suggested that maybe here I should again do my aside on realism versus nominalism. Realism and nominalism, for those who are unfamiliar, is based on the recognition that when we look at the world, our faculties naturally begin to identify genera and species, groups, right? Human, cat, dog, common properties, bipedal, and it begins to order the world, process the world in terms of these genera, these species, these common properties, things like that. And the question of realism is, why does the mind do that? Is the mind doing that because those things are, real? Those are part of the structures of reality. And if you say yes, then you're a realist. Or are these mental fictions? Is it that everything's just sort of unique? There are no groups, there are no genera, species, common properties, whatever. It's all just sort of idiosyncratic matter. But the mind needs to organize it, so it invents a bunch of names, right? Invents some mental fictions for organizational purposes, and then we impose those on the world, but they're not real. If you say that, you'd be anomalous, from the Latin nomen, for name. So you're suggesting that those are names that we impose on the world, but they're not real. So I'm an advocate of realism. And one of the reasons I'm an advocate of realism is because my starting point, my first principle, is that I presume my faculties are functioning properly and they're aimed at truth-telling. If nominalism were true, then I would have grand reason to distrust my faculties, because the fact of the matter is, when I look out into the world, I can't stop thinking like a realist. Everything I look at, everything I process by the very act of perception, things according to genera, species, and things like that. It's automatic, right? This is one of the reasons why Gilson, who I believe is a Thomist, yes. Why did I say believe? I know he's a Thomist. Okay, so Gilson, one of the things that he says is, he says, the first step to convincing somebody of realism is to help them to realize that they have always been a realist. The second step is to help them to see that the moment they cease to play a part in a philosophical dispute, they will go back to being a realist. And the third question is and the third step is to get them to ask why. In other words, Gilson's point is that it's just something that is so woven into your faculties that you can't stop doing it. You've always done it. Even if you start to play the nominalist in a philosophical dispute, you'll go back to being a realist. And the question is, well, why, right? Well, maybe the reason your faculties process the world in that way is because the world is that way. And so in keeping with that, as an advocate of properly functioning faculties, I'm inclined to say that I have to embrace realism because it's just sort of woven into my faculties. And if realism were false, then my faculties are perpetually, with every step, every act of perception, telling me fictions, falsehoods that I can't shake, that I can't get rid of. And so for that, that's one of the reasons I've advocated realism. Well, I think the same is true of morality. So in terms of moral properties, we naturally begin to process the world in terms of right and wrong, and we can't seem to shake that. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, when he makes his moral argument, one of the things that he points out is that even people who begin to try to take, the position that suggests that morality is really just sort of convention, social norms, whatever, they don't live that way very long. It doesn't take very long before they say, hey, you ought not to have done that, or that's not fair, or they start to invoke the rules of morality. And I think you see this all the time. I think we can't help but at some point, even when we try to shake off morality or suggest that somehow it's relative, even folks who want to somehow say, for example, that morality is totally relative and all things should be self-actualization, and whatever floats another person's boat or whatever, pretty soon they'll be chastising those who end up imposing morality, as if that's wrong, right? Morality always seems to reintroduce itself, and we can't seem to shake that, which is one of the reasons I'm inclined to think, again, one of the many reasons I'm inclined to think that those moral intuitions are telling us true things about the world. Well, in this light, this is where the point that I made before, that moral properties cease to adhere without free choice, leaves me, I did it there, free will, leads me to conclude that we must have free will. Now, this is in some ways similar to an argument that you find in somebody like Immanuel Kant. Now, far be it for me to invoke Immanuel Kant. I've published on Kant a lot. A lot of people presume for that reason I must be a Kantian. I am not. I find few people in the world more wrong than Kant. But nonetheless, I do think on some of these matters, he's actually quite good, right? So Kant actually ends up looking at what are the needs of reason. These are some of his transcendental arguments, right? Where he looks at the sort of structures of reason and he suggests, well, what does reason need in order for this to be so? And this is where freedom is one of those things. Kant recognizes that our moral intuitions about the world, and we just can't shake and are just sort of there woven into the fabric of the mind, end up demanding things like contrary choice, end up demanding things like free will. And I think that's quite right to attend to that sort of thing. And so on a properly functioning faculties argument level, I think that's correct. Also, in terms of the livability factor that I mentioned before, I think it's interesting that even people who fret over free will, they will end up making a series of choices, hoping that they can somehow sort of shake themselves out of that. They'll be like, well, make a case for me, convince me, right? Do something. And so it's rather interesting because they operate in a way where it's almost as if there is a certain indeterminacy about them, a capacity for them to be pliable and to shift their belief sets. If they can, sort of find the right sort of angle or something like that, they might shift. And so it's rather interesting because here, even though they have deterministic instincts, they're operating like folks who have choices to make, choices that might, bring about a different sort of outcome. And so again, similar to other aspects of unlivable, I've talked about how skepticism is unlivable. I think determinism is unlivable. It's unlivable because we tend to reassert morality, right? We presume morality is there. We hold people accountable. It doesn't take long before we blame somebody for making a choice that we think they could do otherwise. And then we operate in ways where we presume there are determinations that are things that are up to us, that are in our hands, and that we have real choices to make. And so on the unlivability front, I think it's also something that, I think the livability front, the practicality front, ends up advocating for free will. Also, I think there's another epistemological issue here. Epistemology, how do you know that you know that you know? So I had mentioned that properly functioning faculties argument, in favor of free will. I think the fact of the matter is that if determinism is true, you would suddenly have reason to doubt your faculties and with it, your belief in determinism. Here's why. Let's say you're a physical determinist, for example. And so you believe that the world there are reasons why the world is the way it is and it can't be otherwise, right? And if we're a physical determinist, we believe that those reasons are ultimately that all things are just matter in motion, and that includes, you, and those things are fully determined by the laws of physics. Those are immutable, and so those are the reasons why whatever is, it can't be otherwise. Okay, if that were actually the case, then you would have to conclude consistently, if you're going to be consistent with that belief, you would have to conclude that your belief in determinism, your conclusions about determinism, are a product of nothing more than matter in motion, and could not be otherwise. In which case, the very fact that you sit there and you look at your own belief, and you look at it as if it's something that you have reasoned your way to, is actually contrary to the very belief that you have, the belief in determinism. But you would have to add, right? So on the one hand, you'd have to abandon that sort of impression that you have, the impression that you have somehow reasoned your way to determinism. Because quite the contrary, what has happened is just sort of the dominoes of materiality have led you to hold this belief to be true. It is not something you have sort of reasoned to and chosen in any sort of way. It is an inevitability. You just find yourself having it. But the other thing with that is you would need to doubt the reliability of that, right? Because this is similar to an argument that Alvin Plantinga makes with regard to evolution. So Plantinga points out that evolution, if you believed in unguided evolution, you would have to believe that all things are just sort of mechanistic processes aimed at survival. And I say unguided, like we're here presuming atheistic, a naturalistic, atheistic form of evolution. Well, the fact of the matter is that survival and truth-telling are not always aligned. And so if the mechanism for how evolution unfolds, how your faculties unfold, is something that isn't aimed at truth-telling necessarily, but survival, then you would actually have reason to doubt that your faculties are, sort of as they have evolved, are faculties that are aimed at truth-telling, in which case now all of a sudden your beliefs about the world become suspect because the origin point of your own faculties is dubious in terms of whether or not it's designed them. They're not designed. Whether or not it's constructed them in a way that aims at truth telling. Now, Plato suggests that now, if you were a theistic evolutionist, you could suggest that God has sort of engineered things in such a way that he wants to produce faculties aimed at truth telling, so you could get around that problem. But a naturalist atheist, you could not. This is similar to a problem I've pointed out with regard to Descartes, right? So Descartes, when he's sort of doubting that everything exists, right? Descartes is known as a hard foundationalist who ends up toying with this idea. The starting point is for his philosophy, he's going to doubt everything. And at some point, when he's doubting everything, one of the things he entertains is that his beliefs are a product of an evil demon, right? That he is just being deceived, and he has a whole bunch of false illusory impressions, kind of like being in the Matrix, right? If you've seen that movie, where the entire idea is that maybe I'm not really in a room right now. Maybe I'm not really talking into a microphone. I'm just a brain in a vat or something like that. I'm being deceived by an evil demon. Again, these sorts of things, they go to a problem of the origin point of your faculties. Descartes, in that experiment, ultimately concludes that unless God is the source of his faculties, God, who is good and is not a deceiver, unless God is the origin point of his faculties, he can't trust his faculties. And so both of these arguments, from their own sort of unique vantage point, they go to this point that says, like, look, the origination of your faculties matters to whether or not you can trust that they are aimed at truth telling. If they're random happenstance, right? If your rational faculties are really just sort of a developmental sort of organism, sort of from random happenstance aimed at survival, there's no reason to presume that those faculties are aimed at truth telling. And for that reason, determinism gives you a similar sort of result. If at the end of the day, my faculties are a development of a string of physical causes that are just bound by the laws of physics, there's no reason to presume that those laws are aimed at producing faculties that are aimed at truth telling. And for that reason, as a determinist, I would have reason to doubt that my faculties are reliable, that my faculties are somehow aimed at truth telling. So not only would I have to relinquish this sort of illusion that somehow I reasoned my way to determinism, or that I'm engaged in a dialogue or listening to the monologue of Dr. Jacobs, and he might persuade me to believe libertarian freedom instead of hard determinism. I'd have to abandon all of those as illusions, because ultimately my belief in determinism demands that this belief just sort of inevitably arises out of physical laws. But also I would have to sit there and I'd have to consider the possibility that, well, if I'm going to be truly consistent, there's no reason to presume that random physical laws inevitably give rise to true beliefs. And so if my beliefs are just sort of an inevitability of matter in motion, then they might be true, they might be false. So I might have to sort of backpedal to a position of saying, well, I find myself having this belief in determinism, but whether it's true or false, who knows? Because it's just sort of a product of the determinism of the machinery, so to speak. So all that's to say is that's a very long way of getting at the fact that I think at the end of the day, hard determinism or even soft determinism, I think determinism ultimately gives you reason to doubt your faculties in similar ways that atheistic evolution gives you reason to doubt your faculties, in the similar way that, Cartesian thought experiments about skepticism give you reason to doubt your faculties. So ultimately, whether we're talking about the theological reasons, such as those mentioned, in reference to historical Christianity, or we're talking about a properly functioning faculties argument, where we're suggesting that our intuitions that we are moral beings with choices to make, or our intuitions that we live in a moral world with moral properties. I think all of those things point in the direction of of free will, or even the intuition that suggests, the practicality that suggests that we hold people accountable. We operate as free beings. We hold people accountable as free beings because, again, we intuit that the world has these moral properties of right and wrong, praise and blame, and all the rest. Or just the very fact that once you embrace determinism of any kind, you have reason to doubt your own faculties. It ends up becoming a self-referentially incoherent position to advocate determinism, but still trust your belief sets. I think all of those things combined point in the direction of free will. Now, I think one of the main reasons that today, when folks sort of challenge free will and they're like, I don't know about this whole free will thing, it's normally not based on intuitions. Like I said, I think the average person, they sort of just intuitively tend toward a libertarian position. Most of us, just coming out of the womb and operating in the world, we intuitively hold people accountable, praise and blame, justice, injustice. We presumably hold ourselves accountable, and we have regrets and shame because we believe that we have the power of contrary choice and all that sort of stuff. We feel good about making a right choice because, we presume that we didn't have to do it, and we feel bad about making a wrong choice because we think we could have done otherwise. And again, those intuitions just rear their head even when people try to cast them off, right? Determinists operate like they have free will. So-called determinists end up holding people accountable and praising people and blaming people and things like that. They just continue to reassert themselves. So I think just on the intuitive level, that is our default mechanism. So when people doubt free will, I don't think it's clearly not based on our intuitions, right? Our intuitions point us toward free will. When it starts to be shaken, it's usually based on like either a theology class, somebody started to study Calvinism and they start to wonder whether or not predestination undermines our free will, or they take a philosophy class and now they're sort of engaging in this concept of, well, maybe you don't have freedom and things like that. But I think the more popular, most common one is a scientific impulse. And here what I mean is that there is this sort of intuition that says, like, I don't know, science seems to tell us that all things are just sort of like matter in motion or causally determined or something like that. And at the end of the day, science is eventually going to tell us that all of our choices are reducible to brain states, which are, physically determined or something like that. I think it's the scientific side of our culture and its sort of reverence for scientism, right? It's an impulse towards scientism that ends up lending itself most to the impulse to say, well, maybe we don't have free will. Now, on that point, there's a video that went around a while ago on this topic that I think is rather useful in highlighting certain aspects about the discussion. And it was involves Neil deGrasse Tyson and then Charles, I don't know how to pronounce his name, last name, Liu. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I think it's L-U-I. Anyway, him and then some other comedian who I don't know his name. But they were talking about free will. And they ended up having this discussion that went wildly viral. People were super engaged in it. And so let's take a look at some of the things that are stated there.
Here's my take. It is true that at some level of resolution that we can observe, causality is absolutely true. Given these initial conditions, this is what will happen afterwards. Exactly. So if you take it to its logical conclusion, then there is no free will because everything is predetermined by things that...
Everything has an antecedent.
Whether you know it or not, something is causing it to happen. But there is also stochastic uncertainty in the universe. It's built in. There's randomness, there's unpredictability. Chaos. Yeah, and so you have to ask, I think, if you're a physicist, what level of chaos actually affects you to the extent that you could actually make an instantaneous decision based on other stuff that's not necessarily in your past experiences or what you have just seen in your current environment. Right?
But wouldn't all those past experiences and your current environment, despite the fact that if you're introducing an element of chaos so that you've never experienced this ever before, your experiences that you have had would then inform your decision about the thing that you've never experienced.
You're Inform is the word.
Oh.
Is it
Rather
inform
than
or dictate?
predicate. Right.
Right. Or require. Right. That's the thing there.
Oh.
Yeah. Here's another physical example of that. A football player is trying to sack a quarterback. The quarterback jukes left. The person trying to sack the QB doesn't have enough time to think about whether to move left or right or up or down. It has to react based on years of training and practice and experience. So in that moment, that action is not free. But in the setting up of that moment, if it was free enough, does that constitute free will? From a physics perspective, it might not. Then again, from a psychological point of view or from a biological point of view, it might.
Wait, what good are you if you're not landing on one side or the other?
Yeah.
I don't need you to say, it could be this, it could be that. And I'm right both ways.
Yeah.
Whichever the actual answer is, I was right.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I would like to have free will exist in this universe, even though philosophically it can be argued that it does not exist.
Would you still be happy with life if some alien said, look, dude, your life is predetermined, there's nothing you can do about it. Keep on believing you have free will. And then they go back to their planet.
You're a puppet on a string.
A puppet on a string from a free will puppet.
You're a free will puppet on a string.
What I would say in that case is that I would hope that the knowledge that I have that puppet on the string circumstance allows me to circumvent it. So the bottom line is, yes, I would still be satisfied with trying to do something different because even the illusion of trying to do something different is in itself a form of free will. Physics-wise, though,
it's not.
That's the challenge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Neil, if you had to right now decide that free will does exist or doesn't exist, what would you prefer?
My thinking over the recent years, because I didn't used to think about this at all, my thinking over recent years is leaning towards the absence of free will for practically everything we think and do in our lives. And I base that on the fact that over time, things that we have done as people in our species, at one time was you are totally to blame for that, or just something you did or something we've learned, no, this person is more susceptible than you are to addiction.
Right.
There's a biochemistry there. This person cannot just be made the life of the party because they're on the autism spectrum. They don't control that. The person who's ready to jump off the bridge, in that instant, do they have the free will to not jump off the bridge? I don't think so. And the more I add up and explore the human condition, I'm forced to conclude that the direction we are headed is that we are all products of an absence of free will. And as a result, society needs more compassion for people who do not otherwise fit in.
See, I have the exact opposite position in my own mind. I feel that it is because of the absence of free will that you see in most behavior, that it is that 1% of free will activity that moves us in the right direction, bends us toward compassion, takes the arc of history toward justice. See, I have free will over some things and not over others. Okay. Someone can see me and say, that person needs help in this way and has the free will to help me. I see somebody else who needs this help and free will. Together, it is a network. It's not that any individual.
So you have to draw the line for every individual and even perhaps for society.
Okay.
Does the criminal who's born in poverty have free will to not be a criminal if most of the people in prison came in below the poverty line? So there's some sociological force operating there that where we are less susceptible to that force.
I think that's a great question, analogy. Let's say this. Say those folks who have been branded criminals by our society are incarcerated.
Yes.
We can then, who were fortunate enough not to face those same circumstances, who are not incarcerated, can look at these incarcerated people and instead of saying we must keep them away from society, welcome them back.
So that's called restorative justice.
Yeah, that's a free will example of the exercise of free will.
Of society.
Of society toward individuals who may not have had the options, had the life experience to recover from a bombed joke.
The people who cannot shake whatever it is that afflicts them tells me that free will cannot be as free as we think it is.
It is, in your words, a perimeter of ignorance. When Newton said we couldn't explain certain things, right? God must have done it.
Of course.
That's a God of the gaps.
Of course.
That delineates what we don't know. The line you describe, I hope, is in fact that perimeter of ignorance which we slowly are moving toward and moving so that we do understand what the true nature of free will is.
Okay, so this video, it ends up, it's truthfully, it's not a very well nuanced discussion. Now, they're scientists, right? They're scientists and one comedian. They're not trained in philosophy. So I should not be shocked. Scientists are not actually great philosophers, believe it or not. And so it should not be surprising that there's sort of a lot of sort of fumbling around topics that are much more finely nuanced in the history of ideas. But there's really sort of three, for all of the sort of disorganized conversation that goes on, there's really sort of three main themes or considerations that come up in this discussion. The first one is basically the idea that everything has a cause, right? Or an antecedent, as Neil puts it. And so the presumption here, right, the concern here is that, well, if everything has a cause or there's an antecedent, to every sort of event, then in some ways, doesn't it have to mean that ultimately that all things are determined, right? So that's the first sort of move that we get, with Neil advocating for some form of determinism. So that's one of the issues that's there. The second issue that comes up is this issue that is a distinction here where what they're talking about is the distinction between sort of inclining influences versus determining influences. So it's interesting, right? That Charles keeps on bringing up the idea that there are these things that might incline us in a certain direction or make us predisposed toward a certain direction, but they're not definitively determinative. And then meanwhile, Neil is like, no, I think they would have to be determinative, right? And so you're getting that sort of question of are all inclining influences determining influences? That's the second theme that comes out there. And then the third is the question of whether or not there's this sort of, I think Charles calls it like a parameter of ignorance, right? Where he's talking about this boundary line where there's certain things that we don't know, and he wants to believe or he wants to think that there are certain features of reality somewhere beyond that sort of line of what we can see that is determined, that there is a certain level of indeterminacy to reality, and admitting our ignorance of, the whole scope of reality and suggesting maybe free will, this power of contrary choice, contrariety, sits somewhere on that other side of that boundary of ignorance. Now, the reason I think this is actually, for all the sort of sloppiness of the discussion, the reason I think it's rather interesting is because it's a very popular sort of recapitulation of a discussion that centers around these types of discussions that center around Leibniz. So at the opening, I mentioned that I've just finished up a book on Leibniz. And that book is on Leibniz and the problem of evil. And I'm not going to talk, again, don't worry, this is not a podcast on Leibniz. I'm going to talk, but Leibniz is exceedingly relevant because all of those topics that I just talked about end up, sort of making their way into discussions about Leibniz and free will. And in the book that I just finished for Routledge, I talk about this fact that I actually do think that Leibniz is an advocate of libertarian freedom. Now, that is wild and crazy. Anybody who knows, Leibniz studies knows that Leibniz is pretty much presumed to be a determinist. But I go through in that book a variety of things about the influences on Leibniz, the sorts of materials that he's drawing on and reading and things like that, and identifying what I think are sort of interpretive blind spots with regard to him. And the reason I bring this up is because all the interpreters of Leibniz are engaged in all these same topics. And so let's take the first one, right? You see this same sort of echo of Leibniz, where Leibniz is an advocate of what's called the principle of sufficient reason. We'll call it PSR. So the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR, PSR basically says that everything has a cause, right? Everything has a reason why it's so and not otherwise. So if there was an explosion in the other room and you were like, whoa, why was there an explosion? And I said, well, I mean, there was oxygen. Be like, well, I mean, okay, that's a partial explanation, but there's oxygen in this room, and it's not there's not combustion happening in here, so that's not a sufficient reason, right? In other words, you would start to trace down the reasons, right? Well, there was a gas leak, and then there was a spark, or something like that. You would end up tracing down the explanation until you found a sufficient reason. Saying oxygen is a partial reason, but it's not a sufficient reason to explain the explosion. And so you continue to trace it down. And so Leibniz is an advocate that things don't just happen. There are no just brute facts. There are reasons why things are so and not otherwise. So everything has a sufficient reason for being so. This is PSR. And this goes to the very point that sort of starts to put Leibniz in a determinist box, or at least according to his interpreters, similar to the discussion that happens with Neil deGrasse Tyson and Charles, where the entire point is they're saying, well, yeah, but science tells us that everything has an antecedent or a cause, right? They're basically saying PSR, things don't just happen, right? There are reasons why they're happening. There are causes. And once people start to do this, the very difficult thing you run into is you start to trace back and say, well, but what's the cause for you choosing the way you did? And before you know it, you end up down this chain of causal necessity where you start to, lean toward, I don't know, is it physical determinism, psychological determinism, theological determinism? You start to chase the chain of causes, and before you know it, you end up having a fixed order of causes without the possibility of contrariety. And that's one of the reasons why Leibniz is oftentimes read as a determinist, because it's presumed that PSR just sort of demands that. Now, the interesting thing about this conversation is when you see Neil and Charles get into the dispute over whether or not all inclining influences are determining influences, that again goes straight to Leibniz. So Leibniz actually tries to say, when defending freedom, because he is a defender of freedom, everybody recognizes that he wants to defend freedom. The question is, can he defend freedom? So again, this is very analogous to the sort of discussion you see there. He wants to say that not all inclining influences are determining influences. Again, very, very familiar, right? Sounds very familiar. But again, most of his readers say, well, yeah, but doesn't this mean that isn't for Leibniz an inclining influence? Doesn't that mean that isn't any influence that inclines also determining? Because if the reason I chose the way I did is because of that inclination, then isn't that inclination actually determinative, right? That's the reason I chose it, right? So again, there's a similar sort of parallel that happens with Leibniz. And I'll get back to the sort of ignorance part, because I want to bring that in as well. But here's what I'll say. The reason I think Leibniz is a valuable springboard is because this discussion is stumbling around the very sorts of issues that I think are at play in the discussion surrounding free will and Leibniz. And so I think he's probably a good place to sort of round out our discussion and look at this more sort of contemporary sort of tone, right? This is a contemporary approach to Leibniz, because Leibniz is an interesting figure in the sense that he is a student of the Church Fathers and of the medieval scholastics. So he's very classical in his thinking, echoing a lot of the sorts of things that I've already talked about. And yet he's also at this hinge point where you're starting to get determinism and soft determinism / compatibilism and these other sort of innovative things. And so I think he's an interesting hinge point in those sorts of discussions. And that's why I think he's a really useful person to look to in order to bridge this divide between the sorts of classical, discussions of freedom already mentioned and the types of things that we see in this video. So with that, let's talk about a few of these things. So the principle of sufficient reason, PSR. Okay, so yes, Leibniz is an advocate of PSR. And here he wants to suggest that for that reason, there are reasons why we choose the way we do. And for that reason, he thinks that we choose in accord with our inclining influences. Now, this is the first place where people want to say, the readers of Leibniz want to say, well, but if that's the case, if there's a reason why we choose, and the reason is the inclining influence, then we can't draw a distinction between inclining and determining influences. Because to incline is to determine. It's like a balance scale, right? If a balance scale is sitting there and, it inclines in this direction or that direction, then, to incline is to determine in the given direction. And part of the interpretive, pushback against Leibniz is that they want to say also, it's not just that he thinks, we operate in accord with our dominant inclination, with, our inclinations, but it's also that he rejects equipoise. Okay. So equipoise is a term that obviously means like equilibrium. And the reason that's relevant is because what's another interesting sort of subpoint of the discussion that you see between Neil and Charles is this almost tendency to say like, well, when asking what free will would be, it's almost like they want to say, well, it would be causeless or it would be random, right? Those are the sorts of two things that come up, right? So like everything has a cause. And so free will would be like a causeless event, which sounds crazy. Or it would be chaos, right? Because all sort of fixed orders of causes display some sort of, understandable pattern or structure to them, the laws of physics. And so if your free will was just sort of like not predetermined by some sort of structure like that, then it would just be sort of randomness, right? And so the very fact that Leibniz rejects that, right? He rejects equipoise, he rejects equilibrium, he rejects this sort of random notion of choice that leads a lot of people to say, well, so for that reason, Leibniz has to be a determinist. But I think this is a very odd dichotomy, right? The idea that either you have determinism or you have causeless randomness. Historically speaking, that's really weird. And I think that's part of the reasons why Leibniz is oftentimes misread. So let's start with just sort of Leibniz's rejection of equipoise in order to try to figure out, well, what's the alternative, right? If we're facing a false dichotomy here between fully determined causality and random causeless, phenomena, well, what's the alternative, right? What's the alternative that I think is a more classical picture of free will? Let me start with this concept of equipoise or indifference, right? So Leibniz clearly does reject equipoise. He rejects equilibrium. He rejects this idea of sort of random indifference, right? So this is another thing. It's called a freedom of indifference. But one of the things that's missed by certain interpreters is that when you look at the history of the word indifference, in the scholastics, what you start to find is that there's several different possible meanings. And this is where you start to get an evolution of the discussion. That's very important to sort of like threading this needle that Neil and Charles are sort of dealing with. So in the early discussions of free will in the medieval scholastics, there's a couple of different, the early divide is just over a question of intellectualism versus voluntarism. And this is a discussion where basically the idea is they presume that the mind assesses your options and then the will acts, right? So this is the sort of reason paired with spontaneity thing. And part of the question was, is spontaneity just sort of like bound to inevitably do whatever, the intellect judges? The intellectualist said, yeah, it's like, well, it's just sort of blind. It's dependent on the intellect. So it's sort of bound to just do whatever the intellect tells it. Whereas voluntarists were like, well, if that's the case, then spontaneity is just sort of the last step in the chain of dominoes. It's not really choice. And so that's why voluntarists were like, no, spontaneity has to have, it has to indicate some sort of power of contrariety. And so in the early discussions about free will in the medieval scholastics, that was the first sort of choice. Are you an intellectualist or are you a voluntarist? Everybody wanted free will, but the voluntarists were worried that intellectualism just sort of gave you determinism, which is why they're like, I don't think we can go there, right? But in the early things, it was just sort of like choose or not choose, like choose or reject. But then what you started to have is you had introduced the concept of indifference. And indifference in John Duns Scotus was a concept that ultimately introduced this sort of, multifaceted powers of will, where Scotus wanted to say, well, yes, the intellect or the will can, sort of choose the thing that the intellect presents to it, or it can reject it, or it can suspend its choice and, wait for alternative, options or to see how things evolve or whatever else. He started to create a greater dynamism in the understanding of that spontaneity of the will. And so this is where the initial sort of use of indifference in Scotus referred to these libertarian powers, right? The powers of contrariety. And this is where what you started to get is early on, like the early concept of choice, very primitive concept of choice amongst scholastics was a freedom of contradiction, choose or reject. And then it became freedom of contrariety, and freedom of specificity later, where the idea was like, yeah, the will can choose, it can reject, it can specify a different route, it can redirect, it can suspend its choice, things like that. But around the same time that Scotus is introducing that type of indifference, there's another type of indifference that was introduced by Peter John Olivi. And Olivi, this French theologian, he ends up suggesting, well, indifference is this extraordinary power of the will to break ties, meaning like to choose randomly. So he talks about like, it's this extraordinary power that if there's two coins that are identical on a table, the will can just sort of like choose one, even though there's no reason to choose that over the other or something like that. In other words, he introduces this concept of basically randomness into the will. That's what he means by indifference. And what's interesting is that later in the Jesuit philosophers, specifically Molina, for example, he ends up introducing equipoise, which is more like the Olivi indifference, where the idea was he thought that the key to freedom, being free, is indeterminacy. And so the result was he wanted to suggest that the will is somehow indeterminate, even in the act of choice. Now, this gets you to why a lot of classical philosophers rejected equipoise. And the key here is to understand that a lot of people before Leibniz rejected equipoise or Olivi's type of indifference while still advocating libertarian freedom. Now, the reasons were this. There are two of them. The one is that this type of equipoise, they thought included a contradiction. And that contradiction is that the will is indeterminate when it's determined. What do I mean? The term determined, before it started being used primarily for determinism, that all things are sort of under conditions that make it that they're so and can't be otherwise. It originally concerned the power of choice, that when you're making a choice, like you have an end in mind, like I want to satiate my hunger, and then I choose a means, right? Okay, I'm going to go make a tuna fish sandwich, whatever it is, right? Something like that. And that's why de termino, concerning an end, was used in reference to self-determination, the act of choice. That was its sort of earlier meaning. And so the problem is, what you're suggesting is that if you're Molina, a lot of people thought it was ridiculous because Molina's wanting to say that the will is always indifferent or always indeterminate, even in the act of determination. And that's where people are like, that's nonsense. Like once it self-determines, it's determined. Like, what do you mean it's indeterminate and, determinate at the same time? So that the one thing, on the one hand, they thought that was just nonsense. They rejected it as incoherent gobbledygook. The other reason why they oppose this type of indifference, the sort that you'd find at Olivi, is that they thought it made the will irrational, right? Meaning it's making will or freedom into chaos or into randomness or something like that. And this is where the key, what they thought was really important to understand, is that the will is inherently a rational faculty. And this, I think, gets to the big mistake that you start to see in these types of discussions. The big mistake is that the will and the intellect are conjoined. And I think what you start to see is that there is a tendency to fall into a ditch on either side. On the one hand, there is a temptation to start to treat reason as mechanistic, as a chain of causes, and make the choice just an inevitable falling of the dominoes such that there is no spontaneity involved. And so soon it becomes reason without spontaneity. And then when people want to push against that and advocate for freedom, what they start to do is they start to get rid of reason altogether and make the will random chaos, random indetermination, causeless events or something like that. But the more classical view is reason paired with spontaneity, that both are in fact true. And this is key. The idea being that what the will does is it operates in dialogue with or in accord with the intellect. So the intellect is actually presenting to the will choices, right? It is offering a chain of reasoning and things like that. What the spontaneity of the will, what the choice is dealing with is the rationale presented to it. And so one of the ways I think you might think of it is, this is an analogy I use in my Leibniz book, is to suggest, like, think about it like you have a labyrinth game, right? So if you've ever seen one of these sort of labyrinths, it's a maze that has like a metal ball that you can tilt the labyrinth and it sort of rolls about throughout the maze and things like that. The fact of the matter is that you can only operate within the confines of the maze. If you're going to move the ball, you have to tilt and you have to operate in accord with the confines of the game. So if you see the ball going in a direction that you don't like, you can tilt it back and you can slow it. You can tilt it to the left and send it down a new quarter or something like that. But you have to operate within the parameters of the game. What you can't do is just pick up the ball and just sort of randomly move it. And I think this is sort of the picture of what you get, that yes, the will has this sort of free, fluid spontaneity, like the tilting of the maze. But what it's dealing with is reason, right? And so it has to always deal with the fact that it is a rational faculty, meaning it is considering the choices before it. It's considering its ends. It's considering its means. It's considering outcomes. It's considering the direction it might go. It's considering consequences. It's considering all of these sorts of things. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, because it's not random chaos, right? It is a spontaneity paired with reason, meaning it is directing or freely engaging in a rational process. It is not somehow an external, chaotic, random, causeless sort of process. And I think truthfully, this is the sort of thing that if we're examining, what we sort of experience intuitively, what differentiates us from the dog, this is what we begin to see, that yes, on the one hand, what separates us from a dog is that we are able to take a beat. We're able to engage in that metacognition. We're able to make an examination of the choice, of the order of nature, to reason about it, and so on and so forth, and then make a choice. But that metacognition is not detached from reason, right? It's engaging, or it's utilizing reason in order to do that. And so for that reason, it is sort of, it's a rational process, not a random happenstance, sort of causeless sort of process. And I think that is, I think that's critical. Now let's consider then the problem of PSR, right? The principle of sufficient reason. One of the things that's sort of noteworthy about this is that when folks engage with this question of, I don't know, is there any event that is causeless? I think that's the wrong question. Of course, Leibniz thinks that our choices have a cause, right? The will, free spontaneity. That is a cause. So one of the things that's ironic is when you sit there and you say, well, everything has a cause, right? And if it has a cause, then it's determined. Well, that actually begs the question. And here I'm using begs the question, not in the sense of recommends or beckons the question. I'm using in the logical fallacy sense. It presumes the conclusion as one of its premises. That's what begs the question. Anyway, enough with that aside. When you suggest, well, if it's cause, then it's not free, you actually are presuming that causes are never free, that there's no such thing as a free cause. You'll recall that I had mentioned Augustine's response to Cicero. Well, in that response to Cicero, Cicero's way of forming the worry about freedom is that foreknowledge indicates that there's a fixed order of causes, that somehow, the diviner foreknows. And if that's the case, then there's no freedom. But Augustine's response is, Well, your will, your free choices are one of the causes in the fixed order of causes. In other words, one of the causes in the world are voluntary causes. So if it's true that you have this power of contrary choice, if you have a spontaneity, right, a free spontaneity that is able to freely engage in reasoning and assessment and ultimately in choice, choosing a certain pathway that's available to it in the analysis process, then that would indeed be a cause. It's just that it would be a free cause, a cause that is of such a kind that it is chosen one way, though it could have gone another way. So it is still a cause, right? This doesn't deny that there's a fixed order of cause. It doesn't deny that every event has a cause. It's just suggesting that not all causes are mechanical. Not all causes are of such a kind that they can only produce one outcome. But rather, your will is of such a kind that it has potencies of multiple kinds, and it has the power of self-actualization. It has the power of self-determination to decide for itself which potency it will actualize. But it is a cause. And so this is where I think the misunderstanding that's there in the first objection, in that first theme, is to think that somehow identifying the power of contrary choice means that you're suggesting that there are no, that there are causeless events, or it means that somehow it is random. Neither of those is true. Right? First of all, it is not a causeless event. The will itself is a cause. And so it is a voluntary cause. It's just that some causes have multiple potencies and are self-determining in the sense of which potency it'll bring about. Not every cause is sort of a unilateral mechanical cause. So it is a caused event. The second thing is it's not random or chaotic. It has a reason for doing so. We could look at the sort of order of reasoning about the choices before it in order to see why the choice was made. It's not random. So both those things, I think, are false in the sense that they are sort of misguided assumptions that end up sort of falling prey to this sort of odd notion that freedom means causeless or random or chaotic or something like that. None of that sort of stuff is true. Okay, the other thing is this inclining versus determining influences. Again, with Leibniz, one of the reasons that Leibniz is oftentimes presumed to think that an inclining influence is a determining influence is because they're like, well, he rejects equipoise, he rejects indifference. So he thinks that whenever you choose in accord with your dominant inclination. True. But this is where the important thing to recognize is spontaneity. Okay, so yes, let's do a sort of thought experiment where it's like, okay, I'm starting to go down a certain chain of reasoning, right? And I'm reasoning about whether or not I want to go to the grocery store or whether or not I want to wait until tomorrow and so on. And I get to this point where I make a choice. And this is the part where you raise the question of, well, that was the dominant inclination and I made that choice. And so now we can look at it and we can see the rational structure. But now you're in this question of saying, well, is it possible that you could have chosen otherwise? And this is where spontaneity is key, because if you say no, remember how I had said that there's this ditch on either side where you either tend to get rid of reason or you get rid of spontaneity. The tendency to say no leans in this sort of psychological determinism thing, where like the choice is just the last step in the chain of reasoning. But that's not spontaneity, right? That would be just reason without spontaneity. That would mean that reason goes down a certain pathway, and when the last domino falls, that's the choice. Spontaneity suggests that there's something underneath it, that there's freedom underneath the processes. So yes, you do, if I'm using Leibniz as an example, you do choose in accord with your dominant inclination. When you made that choice, when you terminated the rationale, you did so in accord with the dominant inclination. But it is a spontaneous termination, meaning you could have allowed the chain of reasoning to continue. You could have redirected that chain of reasoning. You could have injected or pointed toward other chains of, other considerations and things like that. In other words, yes, it is a rational process, but it's not a mechanical rational process. It's a rational process that has beneath it, that has underneath it spontaneity that can direct and redirect and is only ever terminated by an act of freedom. And this is actually a critical feature. One of the things that you find in that ancient discussion amongst the early church fathers, and then later in people like Leibniz, is the idea that nothing can move the will but the will itself. So you and I, this is one of the bases for the medieval scholastic distinction between intellect and will. You and I know what it's like to come to a chain of reasoning, to be laying there on the couch and think through, I should go work out, and you're still laying on the couch. The chain of reasoning doesn't move you into action, right? It's only a spontaneous act of will that moves you into action. So if you lay there on the couch and you come to that conclusion and then you're like, okay, that's what I should do, and then you act, yes, okay, you'll go and work out. But if you suspend choice and you just sort of lay there and you let things move on, then there may be other passions that come in and say, yes, but laziness does feel pretty good, and so on. And so it is an organic process that's only spontaneously terminated. And so that's the important part. That's what I mean when I say that the error on either side, right? The ditch on either side is either to treat the chain of reasoning as if the chain of reasoning moves into action. It's just a series of dominoes. When you get to the last domino, that's the action. That would be reason without spontaneity. Or to make the act purely irrational, right? So that it's just total randomness. And this is where I think the balancing act is exactly what we all sort of recognize. So it's interesting that Neil and Charles are going back and forth, where Neil wants to say, yeah, but people find themselves with certain inclinations. They find themselves with certain dispositions. They find themselves with certain biological, predispositions. They find themselves in certain circumstances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Charles is like, yeah, but those incline, but maybe they don't determine. And that's correct, right? So the point is to say this, that yes, of course, things incline, right? The church fathers consistently, the Stoics consistently, they talk about the passions, these pre-volitional, that's what they talk about, animal impulses that are just in response to good and evil, the sorts of things you perceive around you. But unlike an animal, where that pre-volitional passion moves into action, you actually have the power of reason and spontaneity to actually pause and assess that and make determinations and spontaneously act in accord with it or reject it, redirect, something like that. And so the difference is that you actually have this buffer between inclination and action. Now, again, that doesn't mean you act randomly. When you act in accord with inclinations. If your passions incline you to lust and you act on them, you acted in accord with a dominant inclination. But the whole point of spontaneity is that the inclination can't move you into action. The impulse to lust doesn't automatically start to move your legs running in the direction of, a prostitute or something like that. There actually has to be an act of choice, a spontaneity that decides to concede, a spontaneity that decides to we're not going to look at any considerations of consequences or anything like that, and then just act on it. So that act of will, that spontaneity, is what sits between inclination and action. And that's critical. So the reason I say that's critical, again, is because you're trying to avoid this sort of ditch on the other side. Yes, Neil is correct to recognize that you have inclinations, you have animal impulses, you have conditions, you have biological dispositions, you have all these sorts of things. Those are inclining influences. And when you act in accord with inclinations. But Charles is correct to recognize that there is also this other part of you that has a certain amount of indetermination to it, right? That spontaneity that doesn't have to act on that inclination. It doesn't have to act on that particular passion. It can engage in reason and assess other considerations, other consequences, whatever, redirect itself to higher order sort of things and so on. So all that's to say is you don't want to get rid of, there's no denying the inclination part. The inclination part is important. The whole reason your passions incline you is because your will acts for reason. The whole reason your mind runs through the rationale available to it and thinks about consequences, thinks about options, is because the will is a rational faculty. It spontaneously acts for reasons. So yes, you always operate in accord with reasons, and you always operate in accord with inclining influences and so on. But the key is that no inclination just automatically turns into action. You're not a dog. You have free spontaneity, which is what gives you the freedom to actually resist inclinations, consider alternative inclinations, redirect inclinations, and so on. And that right there, that is the key to a more classical understanding of free will. Now, I'll just say one more thing. And with this, I'm going to close. I had mentioned that they brought up the entire ignorance, that sort of line of ignorance thing. And I think this is an important point. I've mentioned before, when talking about realism, for example, that our mind works in terms of formal properties, and that I think that that it's critical to recognize that there are things that are both beyond reason and below reason, right? That are above reason and below reason, right? So when we think in terms of formal properties. We think in terms of circumscribable, definite properties, common properties, things like lined or colored, or, genera, species, all of these sorts of things. The forms have boundaries. But there are certain things that the mind can't grasp because it's, say, beneath it, right? Whenever I've talked about Aristotle's concept of prime matter, I've talked about how it's pure potential. And I've used this analogy of a shapeless bit of fabric. But I always add the qualification that even that is too definite of a thing, because the fact of the matter is fabric has properties, and Aristotle's prime matter is pure potential. And if you start to engage in that line of thinking, one of the things you ask is you say, well, wait a second, what do I think of? Because if I try to get rid of all the properties and get down to prime matter, I mean, what do I have left? I can't imagine it. I can't think of anything. And that's correct, right? Prime matter by itself is unthinkable. It's unthinkable because your mind thinks in terms of properties, and it has no innate properties. Similarly, if we talk about God, one of the things where you get into sort of negative theology, apophatic theology, God is above reason, right? And that's because he's infinite, right? So he doesn't have the sort of definite boundary lines that you start to see when you're talking about forms. And so he's beyond the grasp of reason because he's so ontologically full, so to speak. And so there are things that are above reason, and there are things that are below reason. Reason deals in that which is circumscribable in this sort of definite set of formal properties. Now, the reason I think that's important is because when saying that, there's still reasons, right? You can still talk in intelligible terms about God. It's intelligible to talk in negative terms about being infinite. It's intelligible to talk about the difference between our type of knowledge and God's types of knowledge. It's intelligible to talk about formal property. You can make the case for why you need to believe in it, but you can't get it in mind, so to speak. And this is, I think, an important feature of epistemology. Just because you can't get something in mind doesn't mean the thing isn't real. There are a great many things that we can't get in mind, we can't conceptualize because they're not a form, and yet we can logically or rationally work our way to them. God, prime matter, I've talked about the same point with regard to the individual or the hypostasis when I've talked about that sort of thing. And I think this is something that's particularly relevant to free will. So one of the things that Kant points out, and again, forgive me for appealing to Kant, but this is one of the rare instances in which I will. Kant recognizes that the way we think, we inevitably think in terms of cause and effect. And he recognizes that for that reason, that becomes a challenge whenever we think about free will, because what we want to think about is we want to, in some ways, demand a cause effect, a mechanical explanation, because that's how the mind just sort of like default works. And I think for that reason, one of the things that people will inevitably, once they start to go down the free will rabbit trail or rabbit hole, whichever one it is, I always get those two. Is it based on Alice in Wonderland? Is it rabbit trail, rabbit hole? Is it both? In the comments. Anyway, once they go down this road, one of the things that they start to run into is even if they want to advocate free will, libertarian freedom, they can't get themselves to think of that spontaneity without thinking in causal terms, that there must still be a cause for why it did that. There must be a reason behind the spontaneity that caused the spontaneity to do the thing, right? They can't think of it in terms of a sort of a free self-actualization or something like that, without thinking of it as random or causeless. And then once they reject random and causeless, now they're back to it being a cause, and they just keep on falling back into the determinist box. Here's the thing. I think Kant is quite right to say that we tend to think in terms of cause and effect. And so that sort of reflex impulse to like try to reduce spontaneity to some sort of mechanical cause and fall back into determinism is something that Kant is quite right to say that that's just something that the mind falls into. Just like when we try to imagine prime matter, we start to imagine formal properties because that's what the mind imagines. But the important thing is to recognize that just because the mind can't imagine it, right, doesn't mean that it's not something that's real and true. And this is where I think the fact of the matter is that we have, from our moral intuitions, from the sort of considerations that have been mentioned here, we do have a very clear concept of what it means to have contrary choice, to choose in a way that could be otherwise, and all these sorts of things that are there in our underlying concept of freedom. And so I think the fact of the matter is that just like with prime matter or like God or the hypostasis or something like that, yes, we do run into a problem of trying to conceptualize, trying to imagine, trying to get in mind a free choice, because, a free choice that satisfies PAP, because our tendency is to make it somehow mechanically determined. And yet the definition suggests that it's not mechanically determined. But I do think the fact of the matter is that we intuitively understand what free will is. And so just because we can't get it in mind doesn't mean that that's not actually the reality of our choice. And so that's what I would say. I would say in terms of that parameter of ignorance, I think Charles is quite right to suggest that I do think that, once we sort of get past these sort of scientific causal analyses, that there's probably this boundary line of reason where freedom resides. I wouldn't necessarily frame it in those scientific terms, but I would frame it similarly in epistemological terms. So even though we run into this problem of conceptualizing what this act would be, because we either start to imagine a fully determined cause or we start to suggest somehow causeless randomness, I think that is a conceptual limitation. But the fact of the matter is we intuitively understand that our choices are of such a kind that they could be otherwise. So even though we might not be able to imagine it, just like we can't, imagine properly God, or we can't imagine properly prime matter because those are somehow beyond sort of the confines of our rational faculties, our conceptualization faculties, just like we still understand what it means to talk about that God is infinite, or to talk about prime matter being pure potentiality. So it is to say that we understand what it means, that we choose in such a way that we could have chosen otherwise. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.